Part of the idea with Foucault is you can never escape discourse. There's no place you can be that's beyond discourse and beyond history where you can look at things and be like, oh, that is what's objectively true. You're always stuck inside of it.
You are now entering Postmodern.
Hello and welcome to the Multiversity Project. Today we've got a very special episode for you. We're going to be jumping headfirst into a war, an intellectual war. More on that in just a moment. This is a reminder that if you like this content, please go ahead and give us a like, a share, check out our Patreon, and be sure to subscribe.
So now for the battle. Today we're going to be diving into modernism versus postmodernism. Both modernism and postmodernism are vast topics. Here's a summary. Modernism is a 400-year-old movement which champions reason, science, human achievement, and the Enlightenment. Truth is real, we can know it, and we're best off doing just that, is the idea.
Postmodernism is a 200-year-old movement which remains popular in academia. It's skeptical of all the things modernism loves, from reason to science to our basic ability to make contact with reality.
Modernism and postmodernism have a rocky relationship. Here at the Multiversity Project, we've never found a toxic relationship we're willing to stay out of. So modernism and postmodernism, be warned, we are here to interfere. In preparation for this episode, we read several essays by Foucault, Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense by Nietzsche, and Explaining Postmodernism by Stephen Hicks.
You may have heard of Foucault and Nietzsche, but who is Stephen Hicks? Well, Stephen Hicks is a controversial intellectual who comes recommended by Jordan Peterson. His work is popular among the IDW and their followers.
Hicks's argument is that postmodernism, the radical left, and the radical right all come from the same intellectual lineage, while liberalism and modernism come from a different lineage. Further, he argues that postmodernism acts as a kind of Trojan horse for leftist politics.
So we're going to start by discussing what postmodernism is. In classic postmodern style, you'll get the joy of hearing all of our individual opinions and interpretations.
But we'll be dialing it back to a more modern level, looking over postmodernism from a hopefully objective lens. Then we'll move on to Stephen Hicks, discussing both his credibility as a scholar and the validity of his arguments.
We'll have a brief discussion on Jordan Peterson and how his endorsement of Hicks influences how we should see him. And finally, we'll end by discussing our feelings, what our hearts and brains tell us about postmodernism after all this investigation. So without further ado, let's get started.
So guys, what do we make of all this? What is postmodernism?
Well, that's a fun question. I feel safe in saying that postmodernism is an intellectual movement that is characterized by a loose association of authors with similar ideas. A lot of those ideas have to do with deconstructing our assumptions and the basis upon which we build rational knowledge.
Okay, so postmodernism is about deconstructing our ideas and the basis on which we build rational knowledge. Maybe we should talk about how do we build rational knowledge in a modernist standpoint.
Yeah, so modernism says that basically the ideas of the Enlightenment are valid, and that's kind of like you're using the scientific method. So you're collecting data about the world, and you're making hypotheses about how the world might work, and then you're maybe running some tests on this, and then based on how the tests went, you can confirm or negate your hypotheses, and then you use those as more or less truths of reality.
Yeah, that's empiricism. Empiricism is a very important part of modernism, one of its dominant strains. Another important strain in modernism is rationalism. It's the idea that by following a train of deductive logic, basically, you can arrive at truth. So some modernists will say we can look at our own minds and observe what we find there, apply logic and rationality to it, and we can arrive at truth that way. But all modernists tend to agree that through one way or another, we can use our faculties to arrive at objective truth.
Yeah, so the way I see modernism is that you believe in some objective reality out there, and you believe that reason and discourse and stuff can bring us closer to that reality.
Yeah, I agree basically with what both of you just said. I see modernism as like the project of trying to get to truth, and truth how the average person would think of it, some kind of statement about external reality that's verifiable and objective and is true not just for you and not just within a particular context, but actually says something about the world outside.
Yeah, and an interesting thing about modernism is no one really agrees as to whether that project succeeded or not. Like, the academic consensus is basically that the modernist project failed and was never able to demonstrate convincingly that we could arrive at objective truth. And yet, it seems that the project of trying to access objective truth produced all these effects that are generally beneficial, like technology and science and prosperity, or at least things that from a modernist moral lens are beneficial.
Yes, exactly. So that's what the postmodernists would say. They would say, well, all of those things are only good from a modernist standpoint. But yeah, no, I definitely agree with you, Ariel, that it seems like having this worldview has led Western civilization to produce a lot of great technology, raise the standard of living for everyone, including poor people. And generally stuff seems to be improving over time, and possibly because of this modernist worldview. So within the empiricist model, that's a conclusion that one could arrive at.
Well, I don't know. Maybe this is controversial, but I think at the very least we can say that we are better at achieving certain goals. Like, we're definitely better at treating cancer than we were 200 years ago. We're definitely better at removing bullets and performing surgery without people dying than we were 200 years ago. We're definitely better at moving from point A to point B faster than we were 200 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think postmodernists would usually agree that modernism is successful at meeting the goals it defines as being important. But I think it would question as to whether, like, treating cancer and pulling out bullets, like, I mean, if I imagine, like, what Foucault might say about something like that, I think if he was talking about those examples, like, a modernist might focus on, like, how do you pull a bullet out of a body, whereas a postmodernist might be like, why is that bullet in the body in the first place? Why do we have a society where pulling bullets out of bodies is a priority? What is the regime of control that a cancer patient must go to get treatment? They tend to ask different kinds of questions.
Yeah, so do we think that postmodernism and modernism are essentially like a thesis and an antithesis, where one is, sort of the status quo, or it was the status quo, and then postmodernism is sort of a rebellion against that?
I'd like to think that modernism and postmodernism are a thesis and antithesis. That's a Hegelian framework of the dialectic, because if they are, it means that we'd be approaching a synthesis where they reproduce in some way, and we end up with an idea that transcends both of them and moves us forward in history. So that's a very appealing worldview for me, but it's not one that many either modernists or postmodernists would be likely to endorse. I think many modernists would be more likely to say, well, one is right and one is wrong, and modernism is right because we're modernists, like Stephen Hicks. Whereas I think a lot of postmodernists, like a postmodernist like Derrida explicitly repudiated the Hegelian dialectic. He basically said there is no process of synthesis. There's only oppositions that are built into language and therefore built into thought. And the oppositions are never dissolved into any kind of synthesis or truce. They just remain in opposition, and all we can do is just become more aware of those oppositions by marking them in language somehow.
So did these oppositions kind of group together?
Yeah, no, definitely they don't group together into two big categories. That would imply some kind of grand narrative or, ontology of good and evil. Whereas Derrida would view it more like there's just these oppositions that they're just scattered throughout language, like big and small and true and false and straight and crooked or straight and gay, like those oppositions. And then they're arbitrary historical relics. There could have been any number of other oppositions. We have these oppositions, we view them as fundamental because they happen to exist in language.
Yeah, so just to back up a little bit, Derrida is often considered one of, the four horsemen of postmodernism. He's considered a major postmodernist figure. And his main thing is basically saying that we cannot escape our own linguistic frameworks, and the words that we use don't actually map onto reality. Words are all just kind of this interlocking web of references to one another. So when he's setting up oppositions, he's not only saying that there are oppositions, he's kind of saying that everything that we think about is defined based on oppositions to infinitely many other things in this interlocking contextual web that makes up the entire way we see and perceive and talk about our world.
Yeah, it's worth noting, too, that the two main postmodernists, quote unquote, that we're going to be talking about today, Derrida and Foucault, don't actually consider themselves postmodernists or poststructuralists, which is how people usually understand them.
Which is such a postmodern thing to do, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're going to be calling them postmodernists anyway.
So in trying to understand what postmodernism is, I found myself, just drawing lots of contrasts between postmodernism and modernism. And one of the things that we already brought up is that modernism seems to have this narrative, right, where there's this grand narrative, and humanity is progressing. There's progress being made, and we're somewhere, but we're trying to get somewhere better. And hopefully, by using some kind of rational method, we can move towards that ideal future. Whereas postmodernism, it seems, is eschewing the idea of a grand narrative, and that there's stuff happening, but it's not really going in any particular direction. Under that framework, I struggle to see what the point of anything is. But maybe postmodernists have a sort of obscure explanation of this.
I would disagree that it's not necessarily going in any particular direction from a postmodern point of view. I mean, it's not going in like a narrative arc direction where everything is improving over time and we're getting closer to truth. But our society definitely is seen as moving in different directions, but Foucault would say that the discourse moves in the directions of power, or at least that's how I would understand it.
Okay. There's a few points to make here. One is that discourses are always pure plural for Foucault. There's never a single discourse. So you can't really say the discourse of society. So that's one thing to note. And that sort of leads to a response to Chris's question, the idea that Foucault wouldn't view power or discourse is a monolithic thing that imposes itself on society. Instead, there's multiple discourses flowing through society at any time. And the word discourse can be understood in a way that's almost similar to narrative. Narrative would be a specific kind of discourse. So Foucault wouldn't say that narrative is something that we create to better to justify discourse. Narrative itself is a kind of discourse. Discourse just means something that we say, basically, or a way that words are used. What's a narrative? I don't know, the Marvel movies or something. Those are narratives that exist in our society. And so Foucault wouldn't say that they exist to justify something else, or that they're referring back, that they're this secondary thing. He would say that they're a primary thing, and that they are discourses, and they pull other discourses towards them in a kind of magnetized pull. Discourses aren't just tools of power, they're also tools of resistance. Part of the deal with Foucault is you can never escape discourse. There's no place you can be that's beyond discourse and beyond history, where you can look at things and be like, that is what's objectively true. You're always stuck inside of it. So if there's a discourse that you don't like, or that's oppressing you in some way, you can't just blow up discourse altogether. You have to come up with a counter discourse. So it's with Derrida, you have big and small. Big isn't meaningful unless they're small.
So I guess in this way, the postmodernists, such as Foucault, would be in direct opposition to Hegel and Nietzsche, right? Because Hegel was proposing this kind of dialectic of history. Maybe there isn't any objective truth, but there's some kind of story of humanity that's happening. And Nietzsche talks about will to power, and I think he attributes a kind of agency in aggregate to that will to power. Those
are both really good points. Definitely. Postmodernists have a particular interpretation of Nietzsche. Foucault, we read, he especially the essay that we read, Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, which published posthumously, is extremely influential to postmodernists. Nietzsche is interesting because he brought about all these different movements that are kind of influenced by him. There's Ayn Rand, which is modernist movement. There's Nazism. There's Jungian psychology, which is a response to Nietzsche. There's postmodernism. So they're all kind of emphasizing different parts of Nietzsche or reading Nietzsche in different ways. So we wouldn't really say postmodernists are opposed to Nietzsche, but they're reading Nietzsche in a particular way, and there's elements of Nietzsche, or there's what other people consider to be elements of Nietzsche that they definitely would be opposed to. Will to power, Foucault, he's very much influenced by Nietzsche's talk about power, but he wouldn't say, you might say Foucault and Nietzsche have a similar ontology with regards to power, but a different code of ethics. Or no, not quite, actually.
Ontology being the kind of more metaphysical part?
Yeah, ontology is what you believe to be true. I'm actually not going to say that because that's oversimplifying. You say Foucault's clearly very influenced by Nietzsche's ideas about power, but there's some distinctions. So I think you're right, Chris, that Nietzsche would posit more of like a universal will to power as part of what it is to be a human being, whereas the postmodernists wouldn't make any kind of claims about that. As for Hegel, a similar thing. They're very influenced by Hegel, but I mean, Derrida definitely placed himself in clear opposition to Hegel with regards to any kind of grand narrative to history or any kind of progressivism, or like the idea of a dialectic that could involve a synthesis of opposites.
Backing up just a second, when you were talking about discourses as tools not only of power, but as also of tools of resistance, you set up kind of a dichotomy between power and resistance. Is there some kind of dichotomy there, or is it more just different centers of power, some being stronger than others?
They definitely posit dichotomies and oppositions, but new dichotomies can be created at any time. And part of the idea of the postmodernist is like, if you have this dichotomy of like the oppressor and the oppressed, like, you know, a good example is like, let's say at a certain point in history, like the 1970s, you had like gay and straight. And that's like a dichotomy of like, from a postmodern perspective, oppressor and oppressed, straight being the oppressor, gay being the oppressed. And so that's like, that's an opposition that exists in language, and that's being, what's the word he'd use? That's circulating in society. So one thing postmodernists like to do is they like to bring attention to these dichotomies by maybe coming up with a category or coming up with a way of using language that is liminal to the categories. So bisexual, let's say, in the 1990s, or more recently of all kinds, like pansexual. So now it like, it undermines that dichotomy a bit by making it makes it so that the dichotomy can be seen, where before it would have been more invisible. But you're still not escaping dichotomy, because once you create a new word, or, you know, you bring a new concept to popularity, like bisexuality or pansexuality. Now they're just new dichotomies that are going to exist. There's new oppositions that are going to exist between these new terms and the old conception. Like, this is a way that Derrida might view it. Foucault would probably say, that knowledge would function and circulate in different ways with these new words you're creating. Power would enact itself in different ways. So you're not escaping power. You're just changing its structure.
So what would be the purpose of creating a new word to sort of redraw the dichotomy? This would be something that an individual or a group would do in order to advance their own interests? Yeah,
that's a tough question and hard to answer. Hang on, I have a thing that's good at one point. Let me read it. Here's what Foucault defines as the fundamental question of the left. What about those who understand the need to tear themselves free from conservatism, if only to exist, and for the long term to keep all from being dead? So I'll read that again. What about those who understand the need to tear themselves free from conservatism, if only to exist, and for the long term to keep all from being dead? So that's, I think, a pretty revealing question, because Foucault there, he's identifying a few priorities, right? Like the priority to exist, so survival, which definitely has been much talked about among postmodernists. Like Judith Butler talks about survival a lot. And he also talks about, he does have a long-term priority here, a long-term goal. So the long term to keep all from being dead. So the life force and vitality of society. And he wouldn't say that, you know, Foucault wouldn't say that that's an objective good, that the objectively good thing is to keep all from being dead and to survive. And that's why I must, he would just say these things are ends in and of themselves. He wouldn't even use that language.
It sounds like he is subjectively espousing that goal, though. He's saying, like, it's important to me, Foucault.
At least from what I've read, I don't know him as well as you, but I don't know if he would say that that's what he's espousing. But it does seem to be the effect.
Yeah, he wouldn't even say that's what he's espousing. He's identifying it as what he views to be a central question of the left.
It's interesting, though, because he created this essential question of the left and spoke about leftism. And kind of, if you take his viewpoint about how, I'm probably going to use the lingo wrong, but like about how language and discourses circulate in society, and then look at the language and discourses that he created with his own works. If you were to view Foucault as someone who was not only a theorist, but also tactical, you you could say that he was advancing some kind of leftist discourse.
Right, and this is exactly what Hicks argues.
Basically, Foucault wouldn't say that he's creating something that he subjectively prefers. He would say he's constructing discourses.
I wonder if that's because he'd be revealing his hand, and that would be a bad power move.
I mean, like the idea is like you can't escape your historical circumstances. So it's like
Right.
you can be a leftist, or you can be this, or you can be a nihilist, I guess. But he wouldn't say like
He's as much a part of the flow or the flows as everything else.
and his preferences are a result of historical circumstances as well. Maybe that's just what I'm getting at. Like Foucault would say, like it's not just that he subjectively prefers something, but that even his subjective preferences are a part of history and a part of like the power relations of society.
Right. So he wouldn't place the source point for anything he puts out on him.
He wouldn't necessarily say that everything just flows through him, but he would say that he's a product of history and that you can't escape your historical context, basically.
Okay.
Do postmodernists, or let's just take Foucault for an example, does Foucault think that there is free will? Where to what degree does free will exist in postmodernism? Is there so it sounds like, you're a product of your historical context and you can't remove yourself from that. And basically there's all these forces, these unseen forces that are controlling you basically. So do you have agency?
I mean, a big part of Foucault's political project was around freedom. And I think the idea is that part of the idea is that when things are in flux and when power relationships are destabilized, there is a greater freedom. But I think part of the idea of Foucault, it's hard to tell whether Foucault's saying you can't escape or whether Foucault's saying it's really hard to escape. I think his work is some kind of testament to the idea that it's possible to have moments of freedom in history when you've successfully managed to disrupt a dominant system of power, or where you've managed to become aware of all the ways that all the bases of your presuppositions, basically. Like when you've gotten to some point, then you have a greater degree of freedom than when you haven't. But I'm not totally sure either. Because Foucault does say stuff like the system that we're currently in has all kinds of ways to capture people who try to rebel. So if you have he kind of he has a metaphor sometimes where you have a fountain, the top bowl of the fountain captures everyone who's living a normal life, maybe the white picket fence 9 to 5 kind of, and then you have a bowl under that's the counterculture, so people who are going to raves and whatever, but the system incorporates it as well. And you have a bowl under that's everyone who's, I don't know, a leftist revolutionary and in some kind of modernist Marxist framework. And then you have a bowl under that. It's everyone who's criminals and prostitutes. And then you have a bowl under that for the mentally ill. So the idea is that society has ways of capturing people, even people who behave in ways that might seem quote unquote more free. And if you notice, with these styles of these ways of looking at things, it's not so much that Foucault is saying he's not so much interested in the question of is everything causally determined, and do I have freedom of action? Can I pick the Coke or the Pepsi? He's more looking at it from a historical framework. To what extent does our society afford freedom, and to what extent does it give the illusion of freedom when none really exists?
It makes sense. It seems like asking the question of the free will versus determinist question would be kind of more of a modernist project, trying to make some kind of truth statement about how the universe works in relation to ourselves.
He talks about freedom a lot, though.
Yeah, it seems like maybe he's operating under the assumption that some kind of free will exists.
Yeah, he might, maybe he wouldn't define these moments as being free, but he talks about, he quotes Merleau-Ponty, who says that the essential philosophical task for him is never to consent to being completely comfortable with one's own presuppositions.
So it seems like another dichotomy that we can draw between maybe modernism and postmodernism is that modernism tries to make statements about certainty, basically. Here's how reality is, here are operating assumptions. And postmodernism is kind of about uncertainty. It's kind of about, here's all the reasons to doubt, that picture of objective reality. because, well, first of all, objective reality doesn't exist. And second of all, there's all these, every time you try to remove yourself from the equation, there's another equation, there's another frame that's outside of your original frame that you still have to remove yourself from. And so you have to keep removing yourself from the frame, but you can never really get out of the frame.
Yeah, Foucault might say that like resistance is trying to do exactly what you just articulated, Chris. But actually, I don't think he'd say freedom, because I don't think he believes you can escape power to freedom.
So it almost sounds like he's advocating that you become more aware, more self-aware, I guess, of all of the influences that are happening around you and in society, and that by doing that you can, somehow like break the gestalt.
He doesn't believe you can ever break the gestalt, because we're still trapped in language and discourse, but you can become more aware of your position. So I guess you can become more of a philosopher in his view, or in Merleau-Ponty's view.
Perhaps you could see your position from different angles that would like illuminate more things that you weren't able to see before.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. Like you get into like Bell Hooks, who made the argument in From Margins to Center that marginalized people are able to see, have a double perspective, as marginalized people can see both from the center and from the margins. So like a woman is able to see like from a male perspective, that she's like constantly having to emphasize with a man to survive, but she can also see from the marginal perspective of being a woman. And same for a Black person, same for a gay person or disabled person. So the idea is that the more you're marginalized, the more multiple perspectives you have, whereas someone who's in the fully dominant position is like trapped in a unitary perspective. And thus the genesis of modernism, according to Bell Hooks. And you can see that idea has become very like...
It does make sense. In order to just live and get through day to day, most people have to kind of understand the mainstream perspective. You're forced to understand that perspective, and not necessarily any others.
So I don't know if you guys want to move to the next part. I think for me, I was kind of framing it as, so there's modernism has a grand narrative and postmodernism does not have a grand narrative. But it seems like in recent years that postmodernism has kind of teamed up with leftist politics, which of course has a grand narrative. And so, there's kind of a contradiction there.
No. Foucault and Derrida would definitely repudiate any kind of grand narrative on the part of leftist politics. It's more about...
So they would say that leftist politics does not have a grand narrative? Or they would say that they don't...
They'd say that they don't. They'd say leftist politics have had a grand narrative historically, but that they don't, and that leftist politics shouldn't. It's more about being in a state of constant, fluid, Aikido-like resistance instead of trying to create some kind of society or having some kind of grand view of history, the way Marxism does.
So, and it would be distinct from kind of the mainstream American left view of progressivism, which seems to me like a very modernist kind of idea of there's truth and we're getting closer and closer to it over time, and we're trying to like align society with truth and justice more and more over time. It's like this forward direction. Yeah,
absolutely. Progressivism definitely comes from the liberal tradition. Well, I guess Marxism is progressive as well. But no, postmodernists would absolutely repudiate progressivism.
Which is what's so fascinating about Stephen Hicks's book, and yeah.
Do we feel like I feel like maybe we could talk about this for a few more minutes. I just want to make sure we have some.
Yeah, I mean, we can keep going into postmodernism, but I just find it frustrating to talk about because it's words just mean something totally different in postmodernism. So even it's like it can't talk about itself because it doesn't have the ability to examine itself.
I mean, it's okay. Here's something that's interesting in Foucault. Just give me a second. I'm going to find it. That I thought was really explained his whole thing really well. Do we need a theory of power? Since a theory assumes a prior objectification, it cannot be asserted as a basis for analytical work. But this analytical work cannot proceed without an ongoing conceptualization. And this conceptualization implies critical thought, a constant checking. So do you get what he's saying there, Chris?
Yeah, it seems to be saying, well, you need a frame, you need a gestalt, you need maybe like a narrative or something like that in order to do analytical work. But then he goes on to say, well, actually, you need to be constantly criticizing. So it how can you criticize if you don't have a frame to criticize? What are you criticizing?
Well, here's what, yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, that you got the first part for sure. He's basically saying, if you want a theory of power or a theory of anything, you need a conceptualization. So you need to get a framework, a narrative, something. But the problem is a theory assumes a prior objectification. So there's always going to be something assumed by a theory. Like you can't just have a theory that just exists as it is. There's always going to be something underneath it. And then you got to find something underneath it. And that's where you get lost. They said the problem is you can't do analytical work without a conceptualization. But the conceptualization is always founded on some prior thing from the past. And so basically, he's like, in the next paragraph, he says, the conceptualization should not be founded on a theory of the object. The conceptualized object is not the single criterion of a good conceptualization. We have to know the historical conditions that motivate our conceptualization. We need a historical awareness of our present circumstances. It's like, because you can't get down to the level of the object. You can't say like, I know for sure this pen exists, and so I can derive God or something like that. Like he's like, you can't do that kind of philosophy anymore, because we know, and this is something that you point out a lot, Chris, like there's always going to be assumptions to anything we assert. So our theories are really ungrounded. And instead of just, someone like Nietzsche might say, well, we will create our own theory ungrounded as it is. That's really not Foucault's style. Foucault's like, okay, instead, let's take the theory and let's go back a step. What created this theory historically? And let's go back a step before that. And so instead of trying to get it to latch on to the objective world, which from a postmodern perspective is futile, we go back historically and we see what are the historical conditions that brought us to this theory. And when we can see it in 3D like that, like moving through history, we have a better idea. We're able to talk about things that are happening now. We're at least able to talk about them now in light of the history of language and discourse.
Right. Exactly. But it sounds like there's this kind of tension in postmodernism between, well, all of the theories are wrong, or all of the theories have some kind of weakness. And so we can endlessly criticize any statement about reality, which of course is true. But that presupposes that there is a theory to criticize. And so, while postmodernism criticizes having a grand narrative or a grand gestalt or a framework or whatever, that framework is necessary in order for postmodernism to do its job, which is to criticize the theory.
You're saying, I don't think that postmodernism is saying all of the theories are wrong or all of the theories have something wrong with them, so all of them have something to criticize. I think it's just saying all of the theories came from somewhere and carry with them where they came from. So we have to look at where they came from in order to have a better picture of what's actually going on. It's not like there's a truth and a rightness and all of the theories aren't living up to that because they're wrong somehow. That's how I'm understanding it anyway. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And, the only thing I would add is there's nothing in that statement, or at least in the first part of it, that theories come from somewhere. There's nothing in that a modernist would disagree with. But a modernist would tend to think we have an escape hatch through our access to external reality. Maybe it's not, all theories come from somewhere, but if you believe that I can do science or I can theorize and I can figure out what's really out there, then maybe the history is not as important to me. History could have been wrong, versus if I think, I can't get out there, I'm just trapped in these theories. I'm just trapped in this web of theory and language and discourse and power. Then, the only way I can even orient myself is by going into history.
I think a modernist would agree that historical context tends to bias, the theories that came out of those historical contexts, and that examining the context that the theory was made in can help you reduce the bias of that theory and bring the theory closer to truth. Of course, where the postmodernists would change that is that they would say, well, it doesn't really get you any closer to truth, but it does seem like they are making that claim. It seems like they're making that claim that okay, you're wrapped in all these layers of historical interpretation. And so by removing those layers of interpretation, you're moving closer, you're getting closer to truth.
But you can't remove the layers of historical interpretation.
Yeah, that might be more a Hegelian. Like, we can understand the flow of discourse, we can understand the flow of the dialectic through history, and then we can see its next step, that kind of thing. But postmodernists aren't making any claim that we're getting closer to truth, or that we're peeling away the layers. They're not really saying we're getting rid of anything. That's the thing. Postmodernism, they're not saying this is wrong, that is wrong, we're getting rid of this, we're sweeping this away. They're not doing that. They're not even saying we can escape the historical teleology. They're not saying we can escape history by becoming aware of it even. They're just saying we can become aware of it. But we're still trapped within it. Our options are still determined by it. We're not going to be like, we're not going to look up and then, rocket upwards to a spot where we're looking down on it from above, like Hegel might say we can do. It's just there, and we're at the front of it. We're at the moment that happens to be called the present moment, but we can never escape it.
So maybe postmodernists would say that it's, or the goal of postmodernists, if insofar as they have a goal, is just this greater awareness. And they're not trying to do anything or affect anything, but they are trying to come to a greater understanding of where we are.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I guess it's doing philosophy. Like, one way to think about it, and I'm not sure this is correct, is like, it's the idea that, this might be good to talk about during the Hicks section, but the idea is that part of the way to come to greater awareness is to participate in these oppositions that form within society, or participate in power relations. You can't just like observe them from the outside and like be like, objectively, the power relation is such and such. Or you have to position yourself within them, or else undermine them in some way. And so I think that's part of the motivation for the idea that philosophy is political, fundamentally political.
Interesting. So you should, or maybe not you should, maybe you do, because of the nature of reality, or the nature of, insofar as reality exists, is that people are participating in these things. And if you pretend to be on the fence about something, then you're somehow, I don't know, going against your nature or something like that. And you should just pick a side and fight for it.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's no not taking it. It's not going against your nature. That's the only part I would object to, but there's no sitting on the fence. Those who are sitting on the fence are taking a side, whether they like it or not, or whether they admit it to themselves and to others or not, right? It's like, one way to look at it is of like, you're walking down the street and you see, a big guy beating up a little guy. You can just be like, I'm not going to get involved, and keep going. But that's still an ethical choice, right? You haven't not made an ethical choice.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. So it does seem like a lot of the postmodernists have chosen the sort of leftist side of politics.
Yeah, this might be a good place to get into Stephen Hicks. I mean, a lot of postmodernists have chosen the to support oppressed people in various ways, or to undermine power relations, because they tend to view it. I think one way of looking at it is they view that as the way to actually that's how you do philosophy. That there's less philosophy you can do by taking the stance of the oppressor, because the oppressor stance is the stance that everyone already knows.
So there is some kind of drive towards equality, where this reality tunnel, let's say, is not as acknowledged as the reality tunnel of mainstream society, and so we should support it so that we can have a more dualistic, or like a multiplicity of reality tunnels.
No, they're not looking for equality. Maybe you could say they're looking for movement, or understanding, or survival. But they would say that as soon as an equality seems to have stabilized, there'll just be another. It'll just, if things end up like this, then they'll just like polarize again in some way, or there'll be like a new polarity that like is polarized with that like equality. And yeah.
Right. I mean, maybe there's some sentimentality to it. Like maybe perhaps some postmodernists are really motivated by wanting to help the oppressed out of a sense of empathy, or just out of some sense of injustice. But even just from like a pure intellectual standpoint, it sounds like you're saying that placing yourself in a position of being on the side of the oppressed and undermining the oppressor would illuminate more intellectually than remaining within the dominant narrative.
I think that's part of the epistemology. This is probably a good place to get into Hicks.
Yeah, so maybe this is a totally different argument from Hicks, and maybe we can just skip past it. But I was thinking, so since there's a lot of leftists who seem to be, or a lot of postmodernists who seem to be associated with the left, and since postmodernism postulates that the team that you're on has something to do with the historical context in which you were born and raised, then maybe the postmodernist explanation for this would be that progressivism came out of the Enlightenment, and their Fourth Circuit, as Robert Anton Wilson would say, was kind of morally imprinted with this Enlightenment morality, which is kind of like equality, like we should support the oppressed, we should guarantee rights for everyone, and we should have things be as equal as possible. So maybe postmodernists would say that, just mainstream society has that morality imprinted on them, and maybe that's why they're heavily associated with the left.
I mean, Foucault kind of does address this. I feel like I want to introduce Stephen Hicks.
Yeah, go for it.
This is an interesting topic, though. I mean, Foucault talks a lot about pastoral power, which is this idea that there's a particular kind of power that emerged through Christianity, which is like the power of the pastor. The fat pastor cares for the well-being of everyone in his flock and is self-sacrificing and concerned for their souls and the afterlife, and there's all these elements to it. And so part of the idea in Foucault is that pastoral power, even though the church has fallen in importance, pastoral power has remained kind of ambient in Western society. And so that's part of, even those ethics that you brought up, like Foucault wouldn't say, yeah, those are good things and we're following them, or even like they're neutral things and we're still following them. He'd say that they're a code of ethics, but they're also a tool for power. They also create a framework through which power circulates. And so it's like the modernist perspective might be that those things like individual rights and equality are good things. Postmodernist perspective would say they're just things that have happened, and they have this element of trying to control people that's inherent to them. And so Foucault wouldn't use that. He wouldn't use that framework to.
Right, but I guess what I'm getting at is that postmodernism has this kind of explicit philosophy and this kind of implicit philosophy. The explicit philosophy says everything is power games and nothing is good or evil. But the implicitness, the implicit philosophy that comes from that is that, well, each person has their own set of polarities that they are personally espousing. And so objectively nothing is good or bad, but subjectively, each postmodernist has values, and they're fighting for those values. And so maybe they're not consciously doing this. Maybe if they realized that they were doing it, maybe they would stop or something like that. But it seems to me that that's implicit in the philosophy. So there must be, since power games are being played, somebody is playing those power games. Maybe the postmodernists are somehow removing themselves from the fight, but that seems unlikely to me.
No, they would definitely say they're playing power games. I mean, Foucault was politically active in a few ways. Like he's very much in support of abortion rights, and like did some. I think he had like activism around that, and disturbingly, both Foucault and Derrida signed this petition. Let me find the name of it. One sec. This is like, I stopped reading Foucault for many years after I found out about this, but both Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze and Simone de Beauvoir and Roland Barthes and all these guys, Sartre, a few of those aren't postmodernists really, but Foucault and Derrida both signed the French petition against age of consent laws in 1977, which basically says that it was basically calling for France to abolish all age of consent laws. So...
whoa, I know some conspiracy theorists that are going to jump on that.
It's like fully true. Like there's like it's on Wikipedia. And everything on Wikipedia is fully true. And nothing that's not on Wikipedia is at all true.
Whoa, but whoa. Because on the one hand, there's postmodern neo-Marxism, which we're going to get into, what Jordan Peterson talks about and Stephen Hicks talks about, and how there's kind of this, Marxist leftist undercurrent to postmodernism that's invading academia and da-da-da-da. But I know some people that are real hyped up about the idea that our society and the power structures and like the mainstream liberal media and like this postmodern neo-Marxist, like our political structures is basically that there's like a giant pedophile conspiracy. And they're going to love that tidbit. Anyway, we can move on. But that's interesting.
Yeah.
And that was the whole Pizzagate thing, right?
Yeah. And I mean, there might be something to it.
I mean, I kind of doubt that there's like, it's like a direct, I definitely have met a lot of people who are like argue, in favor of this kind of thing. And they're like using similar arguments to what the postmodernists use. So I think it definitely influenced public opinion to a certain extent. But I doubt it. Katie, I'm kind of curious, like, how does it connect? Like, I don't really see the connection, I guess.
Okay. The way that I would see it connecting is, I'm not an expert in this, but I can see if you believe that postmodernists have influenced academia and have influenced basically mainstream left-wing media, academia, politicians, society, and discourse. I'm probably using all the words wrong, but I'm not talking as a postmodernist. Okay. Basically, if you believe that postmodernism has really infiltrated and weaved its way into influencing every aspect of liberal society, and most of the conspiracy theorists will also say that there's kind of a leftist tilt to the narratives that we're fed, and there's maybe somebody pushing an agenda. Those people tend to also believe that there's people that believe that there's kind of a pedophile agenda being pushed. And if you look at scandals like in the UK, there were a bunch of well-connected politicians who were found to be part of a pedophile ring, Jeffrey Epstein, Pizzagate, where there were maybe some connections to Clintons and Marina Abramovich, and just, I don't know, like really, it was really complicated. I didn't get too deep into that, but basically there's this idea that there's like kind of a politically powerful leftist pedophile ring conspiracy thing that is influenced by postmodernism. And that would be an interesting point.
Okay, yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I would say, for one thing, like you gotta, like the left is diverse and there's many modernist strains of leftism, like that do say that things are wrong, and like a lot of forms of like feminism or like neo second wave feminism, like this, like the feminism that tends to be really concerned with rape and stuff like that. It tends to be extremely like concerned about pedophilia and concerned with preventing it. But having said that caveat, I would definitely say that whether it's organized or emergent, there definitely are strains on the left that are at least wanting there to be a conversation about whether pederasty is morally acceptable. So I don't know if there's a conspiracy or not, but at the very least, there's an emergent trend among some strains of like third wave feminism. Third wave feminism descended directly from postmodernism.
Right, and this is why, and this is, I think, the same problem that Stephen Hicks has with postmodernism. Maybe he doesn't say it in so many words, but it seems like postmodernism is a convenient front philosophy for, well, I'm just going to fight for whatever I want. And if you tell me that it's immoral, I'll just tell you that nothing is moral or immoral.
Let's just get it. Maybe we should just introduce Stephen Hicks and who he is and stuff. I think his time has come.
All right. Who wants to take that?
I'll do it. Okay. So on to Stephen Hicks. So Stephen Hicks is the author of Explaining Postmodernism, and he's a very controversial figure in the field of critiquing postmodernism. He's a modernist, and he basically draws he basically makes a historical argument that postmodernism represents like a counter-enlightenment movement. And specifically that postmodernism is a revival of leftism after the failure of communism in the Soviet Union. It's a strategy to revive leftism.
Yeah, basically, maybe this is jumping the gun, but there's this term out there, postmodern neo-Marxism. And it's, I guess Jordan Peterson kind of popularized it. And I think that theory basically came from this book. There's probably, or maybe this book basically summarizes what that theory is. And it's basically the theory that the leftists, having failed to create the socialist paradise that they envision, and having to having failed repeatedly many different times to do this, basically teamed up with postmodern philosophers in order to continue the revolution and try to implement socialism again.
Yes, there's really two ways to criticize Stephen Hicks. Some attack his credibility as a scholar, and others address his arguments directly. As you may be able to tell from our 3-hour-long episodes, we never do anything halfway, so we'll be addressing both lines of criticism. So we'll start by taking a little break from all the philosophizing and talking about Stephen Hicks' credibility, drawing on a YouTube video by Cuck Philosophy. So don't worry if you haven't seen the video, we'll be repeating the arguments here. So Katie, what arguments does Cuck Philosophy make against Stephen Hicks?
Yeah, I basically just wanted to point these out before we move forward, so we know that Stephen Hicks isn't necessarily a universally well-respected philosopher. Basically, some of the things that Cuck Philosophy points out, which maybe he's not a well-respected philosopher either, but his video was well-resourced. For one, Stephen Hicks names Kant as an anti-enlightenment, anti-rational figure, which is strange. It's a strange interpretation of Kant, or at least a very controversial one, as Kant is normally seen as one of the foremost Enlightenment figures and put forward a whole theory of morality. And it seems like Stephen Hicks may be getting a lot of his interpretations and arguments from his objectivist, like Ayn Rand, point of view. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind.
Well, I want to add to that, though, I don't know, I thought that criticism was kind of unfair, because, in the book, Stephen Hicks is pretty, he's pretty self-aware of the fact that he's putting forward, a non-conventional interpretation of Kant. He's not just oh yeah, everyone knows Kant is a counter-enlightenment figure. He's saying, Kant is generally viewed as an Enlightenment figure, but I'm going to be arguing here that his ideas actually spread the seed for a later counter-Enlightenment movement, which I think is a perfectly valid argument to make. I don't think that... I find it weird that was put forward as an argument to, impact Hicks's credibility, because it seems to me that that's an argument it's an argument at the level of interpretation, and the way to address it is to address the argument itself.
To summarize, I think the problem with Hicks's argument is just that he seems to be boiling down the Enlightenment to realism. And basically, he's saying that Kant is a counter-Enlightenment figure because he's kind of the first philosopher to separate objective reality from our rational faculties. And so I think he's probably right about that, but maybe it was incorrect of him to boil down the Enlightenment just to.
So I could follow that thread that Hicks was drawing. He was painting a picture of a seed with Kant and this first sliver of doubt to where we ended up with postmodernism. And I can follow that. I don't think that there's nothing to it. I think that this criticism that Cuck Philosophy was bringing up was part of a larger criticism that Hicks was oversimplifying to an extent where it wasn't good philosophy. And that was just an example. But that was Cuck Philosophy's larger. Okay, so another criticism that was brought up, and this is a little bit less interpretational, but could still be considered interpretational, is that Hicks listed some figures as postmodernists who have a debatable relationship with postmodernism, or even definitely they were highly critical of postmodernism, and postmodernists heavily criticized them. One example was Catherine McKinnon, who is a feminist who actually wrote a book called Points Against Postmodernism. And then he brought up another one, Luce Irigaray, whose work is a frequent target of postmodern feminists because of its alleged essentialism. And basically, Cuck Philosophy was saying that Hicks was bringing in these figures who were radical feminists and saying that they were postmodernism because he was trying to paint this link between postmodernism and leftism, but it was sloppy, and he was bringing in people who weren't postmodernists.
Yeah, that's the criticism I think is the most credible. As Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin are not postmodernists at all. And it's weird, like I was trying to think like maybe there's a way they could be seen as postmodernists in the context of Hicks' argument, but their arguments are philosophically like not that different from Marxism. Yeah, they're pretty realist, actually. Yeah, so I don't see how they could be considered postmodernists. So I think that's a valid criticism, although I'd say like, the caution like of attributing malevolence where ignorance can suffice.
Yeah, well, he wasn't necessarily attributing malevolence. It could also be ignorance. He also pointed to at least one false quote and then a few potential misreadings, which seemed like...
Which false quote?
It was I didn't write down what the quote was, but it was a Hitler.
Yeah, Hitler
quote.
says something like, basically, what was it? Basically, National Socialism is Marxism or something like that.
Yeah.
I tried to download the book that Hicks sources that quote from, and I couldn't find a free version of it online. But are we 100% sure that quote is fake? Like in the video, like Hicks quotes another scholarly source that he got that quote from, and then Cuck Philosophy just is like, he doesn't mention any speech, and then Cuck Philosophy is like, Stephen Hicks thinks it comes from this speech, and it doesn't. Here's the speech. But Hicks never actually claimed it came from that speech. And I found that, like, Cuck Philosophy did that a few times. I just sort of got the impression with all this that, like, Cuck Philosophy was going through Hicks and, like, not really actually trying to, like, fully absorb the argument of what Hicks was saying, but just sort of, like, looking for mistakes. Maybe that's also, like...
He definitely was looking for mistakes. I think... At least I got the impression from watching the video that Cuck Philosophy is a postmodernist and probably a leftist, or maybe he's not a postmodernist, but he seemed favorable to postmodernism and to leftism and was probably looking for mistakes. Another point to note, which is true, is that this book wasn't peer reviewed and it was not published by a reputable publisher, even though Hicks is an academic.
It was republished by a reputable publisher, it just wasn't published by an academic publisher. I mean, Occam's Razor seems like a perfectly fine publisher. I don't really see, like, calling them disreputable doesn't really seem super fair.
I should have said it was not published by an academic publisher, although Stephen Hicks is an academic. Basically, the overall point, and if people want to watch the video, we'll link it in the description, is that an argument was laid out that this work was not done with the level of care and thoroughness and basically academic rigor that a book like this should be. He made more arguments that Hicks was misinterpreting various philosophers that I can't really speak to because I haven't read all of these philosophers. I know, having read other reviews of the book, other people seem to agree that Hicks misinterpreted many philosophers. But
I guess I don't understand what the point of this section of the video is. I don't know. Sorry. Go ahead, Katie. Finish your thought. Like, why are we trashing? Why are we trashing a book we're about to talk about? I don't really get it.
Because we're trying to be thorough.
Okay.
Because we don't want to present a book as like, we can make it shorter, but I just think like, basically when I went out and researched this book, the reason why I wanted to bring these criticisms up is I have not read all of these philosophers, but when I read this book, I had a feeling, and it was just an instinct that I was reading something where something might be off. When I looked it up, I found a lot of criticism, including on Jordan Peterson fan forums, who said that this book was not credible. Like, even they were not fans of it. So I think it was important to note that before we go into a deep discussion of this book. Okay. That's all I can say.
I mean, you're basically just saying that this book is controversial, and there are people who don't like it or disagree with it. And
yeah, why don't we just say that? Or saying that people, I mean, I guess it just feels like
should we trust these people? I mean, like
should we even talk about this book if it's so not credible? I don't know. Like, it's,
yeah, no,
I personally think it's credible. Like, all these things that like Cuck Philosophy mentioned as being like inaccuracies, in my view, like there was very few of them that were actual inaccuracies. Most of them were like misinterpreting Hicks or reading Hicks extremely literally. I mean, and there's no doubt that Hicks oversimplifies these philosophers, but like, again, there's no way to not oversimplify a philosopher that wrote 2,000 pages worth of dense philosophy in like a 300-word paragraph or a 1,000-word 2-page summary. Like, there's no way not to simplify, and Hicks is definitely making an argument in this book, and he's selecting what to include from these philosophers based on like his own what supports his argument and what doesn't. But I don't really see that he's saying anything that's, you know, straight up inaccurate. I kind of think that's I kind of suspect a lot of these criticisms against Hicks are polemically motivated.
So this is exactly one of the biggest strengths of postmodernism and I guess critical theory, which is and deconstruction, which are kind of related ideas, which is that, you know, if somebody makes an argument about anything, you can just take it apart by criticizing it and pretend like, you know, it's without substance or something like that. So it seems like cuck philosophy is trying to say that postmodernism is without substance because basically he's discrediting Hicks. He's saying this guy's a joke, you know, like he's making these basic errors and some stuff like that. And I think Ariel is right that he's not looking at the substance of Hicks's argument. He's instead picking these kind of, you know, random little things that maybe Hicks, you know, oversimplified here. Maybe he got a detail wrong there. We don't know because we haven't looked at the primary sources. So, but yeah. I think that's not what we do on this show. we look at the arguments and we analyze them ourselves. We don't look at how credible somebody is. You know, we just look at, are the arguments good?
But we clearly do look at how credible someone is. That's why we're having this conversation. But yeah, that was for the most part well put, Chris. I would say I don't think cuck philosophy is like deigning to deconstruct Stephen Hicks. I think what's also like what strikes me as strange about that video is it seems like cuck philosophy was almost saying that, like, okay, there's an objectively true way to read Kant, and that is not how Stephen Hicks is reading Kant. Therefore, Stephen Hicks is wrong, which is like a completely modernist way of criticizing Stephen Hicks. For me, it's propaganda. Like, I look at that and I'm like, that's propaganda.
See, I look at Hicks and I said, this is also propaganda.
Yeah, maybe Hicks is also propaganda, but Hicks is like at least saying something that's interesting.
Guys, everything is propaganda.
Philosophy was extremely interesting to me. What he said was extremely interesting.
Okay, maybe we should move on.
The postmodernists would say that Stephen Hicks is pushing his agenda, and cuck philosophy is pushing his agenda. Everybody's pushing their own agenda. It's fine.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's what annoys me is I have the suspicion that cuck philosophy is very like self-consciously creating a video to push an agenda and is like misrepresenting that. I guess my biased instinct was that cuck philosophy was deliberately misrepresenting things to push an agenda in a typically postmodern way. Whereas I felt that Stephen Hicks was definitely pushing an agenda, but at least seemed sincere.
What about the issue with the feminists?
Yeah, that was an issue, but I mean, everyone misinterprets Andrew Dworkin.
So actually, I thought it was really interesting that you said that this is so typical of a postmodernist to have an agenda and push it. Because that's kind of what I was saying before. I was like, well, it seems like postmodernists are saying, oh, no, we don't have an agenda. But it does seem like there's always some kind of ulterior motive there.
No, they admit to having an agenda. Go ahead, Katie.
I said I almost see postmodernism as not only a philosophy, but like just a brilliant tactical guide to agenda pushing.
Yeah, exactly.
A truly brilliant tactical guide to political agenda pushing.
Are you getting ideas?
I mean, it's illuminating so much.
No, it works really well, and this is why there are people who are coming out against it, because it's like
what?
No. There's no agendas here. There's agendas everywhere, but really,
well, that's what they say. No, they are claiming to have agendas. That's what they say modernists are doing. They're saying modernists are saying we have no agenda, when really they do.
True, the white male cis.
Yeah, they say the modernists. They say the modernists who are saying like we're just looking for objective truth are just masking their agenda with this cynical appeal to objective reality.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to note too, like a lot of how these things have spread. It's not like everybody who's somewhat influenced by postmodernism is a postmodernist with a deep understanding of postmodernism and all of its nuances. You have people who are engaging in deconstruction like tactics and using phrases like check your privilege, which reminds me a lot of constantly checking power and things like that, without saying that there is no truth or without saying that we can't access truth. Like there's a lot of blending that's happening in pop discourse.
Yeah, for sure. Well, it's like Jordan Peterson talks about, like with ideological possession. Like no one is completely possessed by an ideology, but it possesses parts of you and it speaks out of you sometimes, and other times you're yourself. The modernist Jordan Peterson would say, because he believes there is a self that is separate from power. But yeah, I mean, you see this all the time. In one area where it's particularly like you get like trans politics, which is an interesting blend, because a lot of the justification for trans politics, like especially when you get to like third gender stuff, very much relies on like a postmodern lens. Like there is no objective, or we can't access an objective reality where there's a real biological sex and real objective genders. And so gender is a construction, and so we can construct it any way we want to, and we're going to construct it in this way that's more liberatory. So there's very much like a postmodern motivation for, you know, altering and blurring the meaning of these terms men and women or gender and stuff like that. But then meanwhile, you're trying to fit it into like the extremely modernist framework of like, you know, the medical system or like a legislation, stuff like that. Or saying like, you know, people will on one hand, like they're like saying like, I've always been genderqueer. It's just who I am intrinsically. It's like such a blurring of like a postmodernist framework with like a modernist conception of the self.
Right. It's a postmodernist framework, but then a lot of the justification we're back to talking about male and female brains and people born with male brains and female brains, and like looking at neurological patterns and things like that are extremely, extremely modernist. Gender exactly. is constructed, but I was born the wrong sex.
Yeah, exactly. And like that's something where there's even like controversy within the trans community. Like you get like some trans people are called like true scum because they're basically like, no, like transsexuality is a medical disorder. It's a medical condition and it requires a specific kind of treatment, and we shouldn't be discriminated against on that basis. And that's it. That's what's going on here. That's like the modernist reality, like a modernist view. Like that's what's happening here. And all this genderqueer, third gender, agender, 47 gender stuff, that's just undermining our legitimate political struggle here. So that's like, you know, you get like a modernist, postmodernist split even within one political movement. And then, you know, the genderqueer people will say, well, they're the ones that they're just, you know, becoming the power mongers themselves.
Fun stuff.
So
Stephen Hicks.
Yeah, let's get into Stephen Hicks. So
does anybody want to like summarize? I thought it would be interesting to summarize like his argument. We summarized it a little bit, but like I talked about how he traces philosopher to philosopher. I thought that might be useful. Like he traces the lineage of postmodernism.
Why don't you do it, Chris?
All right. So he starts off with Kant basically rejecting total realism, or I guess naive realism. That's what he calls it. I guess that's an official term, where basically there is an objective reality and we can know it. And you know, some combination of our experiences can bring us into contact with it. And so Kant rejects this, and so that starts this process that he calls the counter-enlightenment. And then I guess Kant is followed up with there's some other people that are concurrent with Kant that I don't remember, but then
it's worth noting. I think what Cuck philosophy was trying to get at, it's worth noting with Kant. He doesn't necessarily say we can't get to objective reality. He says we can't get to external reality. It's a difference, right?
I guess so.
You can get to the objective reality in here.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there's so yeah, you can know your own mind. And then Hicks brings up the fact that the reason why Kant did this is so that he could make room for God, because he was sad that science was kind of sidelining God. And so basically he said, okay, well, we'll have this supernatural realm, and that will be like the ethics and morality, and then we'll have rationality, and that will be like how we understand our internal world. And then he moves on to Hegel, who there might have been somebody between Kant and Hegel that I forgot. But anyway, so Hegel has this dialectic of history, vision of truth, where again, you know, we're completely disconnected from objective reality. So what's the point in talking about it? But the way that truth, or the way that he defines truth, is it's this conversation or dialectic throughout history. And you have a thesis and an antithesis and a synthesis, although he never uses those words. And basically, there seems to be this kind of, he seems to be trying to also reconcile Christian mythology with his conception of reality. And yeah, so basically there's this spirit, and it moves through history, and it occasionally there are these contradictions between the thesis and the antithesis, and then there's this new frame that's birthed out of the thesis and the conflict between the thesis and the antithesis, and that creates the new reality. And so basically we are kind of collectively creating reality instead of they're just kind of being a reality and we're discovering it.
It's kind of both. It's kind of both. It's like we're manifesting the reality that exists through our ideas. With Hegel, it's through our ideas. And then the spirit moves through the movement of ideas through history.
A lot of this reminded me of kind of the notion of, we talked about this in quantum physics. It relates to quantum physics, but also to other things on a more metaphorical and literal level. Like the observer influences the observed. Like by talking about things and by having ideas about society, you're not only just describing it, you're engaging with it and changing it at the same time.
Right, exactly.
It's complicated with Kant because he would view it as pretty deterministic. Or sorry, not Kant, I mean Hegel. Hegel would view it as pretty deterministic. Like there's like a path to history and we're moving there, and like the idea is just searching for almost like an avatar in the world. So you get like I'll say like there's an idea that has to happen at a particular time, and let's say I have the idea but I don't act on it. Someone else will. The idea will come to the surface, and when it does, it'll explode because it's the idea that the world needs. And that's the important part for Hegel. Whereas like Derrida would say like, didn't have to be that idea. It could have been any idea. It could have been an explosion. Could have not been an explosion. It's arbitrary.
That feels like a thesis and an antithesis.
That's how Hegel would view it. It's not how Derrida would view it.
I know.
Yeah, so Hicks goes on to argue that Foucault and Derrida cite Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Hegel as their major formative influences. Okay, so we did Kant, we did Hegel. I guess we should do Nietzsche. Nietzsche seems to have influenced everyone, the right and the left. I guess he's pretty decidedly not modernist.
Yeah, not the modernists, not the liberals. Like, interesting because like one of the arguments in Stephen Hicks' book is that there's these like two philosophical lineages basically, and they barely ever touch each other. There's like the one which he claims influenced both the radical left, the radical right, and postmodernism, which is the one we're discussing right now. And there's another one going through like John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Berkeley, Bertrand Russell, like the modernist philosophical lineage, which inspired liberal democratic capitalism and the Enlightenment and stuff like that, and that they rarely interacted.
Yeah, I guess you had people like Locke and Rousseau kind of concurrently, but they were working within these two different paradigms. So Hicks would say that Locke is Enlightenment and Rousseau is counter-Enlightenment. And actually, it does seem like, so Hicks does make the claim that Rousseau has influenced a lot of these people who influenced postmodernists and influenced the postmodernists themselves.
Do you want to summarize Rousseau?
I don't know if I completely grasped Rousseau 100%, but it was like we were society fucks people up basically, and we have this kind of man is naturally good, I think is what it was, and that we have like basically our in Freudian terms, like our id is our nature, and we have to express that nature, and yeah, basically the power structures that surround us are repressing us. Although that was like post-Freud, so I don't know if I'm really putting that right.
Yeah, not quite repressive, but yeah, and basically that's it. Like the idea is that civilization represses is a good word, tyrannizes our essential nature, and that tribal man is free and happy in a way that civilized man never can be.
Yeah, to me, he basically just seemed like a proto-anarcho-primitivist.
Well, but also like nationalist. Like he seemed to think, like each different nation has like a separate identity and a separate destiny. And so it definitely seems like, yeah, nationalists have been influenced by Rousseau as well.
It might have been
yeah, especially like from like a tribalist point of view.
Yeah, I thought the discussion of Johann Herder was interesting, who was, I forget if he was before Fichte or after Fichte, but yeah, Johann Herder was basically saying like, each people, like each race of people basically had like, yeah, a different destiny, a different morality, a different psychology, and they were incommensurable. So anyone who tried to switch to a different one would always be unhappy. And there was no way of finding any common ground between them because there was no objective standard outside of each race, basically, through which to communicate. And I thought that was just so interesting because I can definitely see shades of that both in like the radical right and in the radical left and in postmodernism. When I first read this book a few years ago and I read about Johann Herder, that like it really like drove home like, wow, like at a certain level the ideas are similar.
They are. I found that really interesting too. It was almost like this kind of idea of tribes and like conceptions of morality and reality and culture like being formed within tribes, like on the one hand could lead people to kind of racism and seeing people as essentially different, but on the other hand it dovetailed in really well with kind of what Derrida was saying about, well, and what Foucault was saying, but about us being like trapped within our own linguistic frameworks and our own flows of discourses. But it's basically just saying that like there have been flows that have been constructed completely separately from one another before cultures and people started mixing, and it creates something so separate that it's basically irreconcilable. It seems to be very consistent with a postmodernist viewpoint.
Yeah, totally. And you can see this idea in popular culture, like when you get the idea that like we need to listen to the voices of the oppressed, like that kind of idea, or like if you have a group of people and it's like I don't know if anyone's ever been in a radical leftist political sphere, but there's often like if someone comes from a more oppressed background, let's say, like if they're a person of color or a woman or a sexual minority or trans, like their voices will be given pedestalized over and above other people's voices to the point where sometimes people even don't want to contradict them. Yeah, and so that comes from the same idea, right? That like the incommensurability, and that's sort of what Bell Hooks is talking about too. Because if you think that it's relatively that it's possible and even easy for someone to absorb someone else's perspective, then that wouldn't need to happen.
It also makes some sense of this phenomenon that I've seen and like a lot of people have commented on lately of almost like a leftist call for some level of segregationalism. Like you're seeing a lot more. Well, I guess the idea of like cultural appropriation is kind of an example where rather than aiming for like a multicultural melting pot, everybody is influencing everybody kind of goal, you're saying like people from these cultures should not use these works from other cultures because it's basically stealing, and you could never understand the meaning and the context, especially if you're coming from an oppressive culture over an oppressed culture, like listening to their music or using their items of clothing is just insensitive and snatching. I can see it.
Well, I think that's one version of the cultural appropriation argument. There's more there's less extreme postmodernist versions of the argument where you get into like stuff like idea of like cultural preservation, I think, which is behind some of the segregationist impulses. So the idea that it's okay for cultures to mix, or for someone to take something from a cultural group that isn't to try something out from a cultural group that isn't theirs, but it's important that it happens in context, and particularly if it's like an item or ritual or symbol of great significance in the culture, or that's connected in some deep way to the deep narratives of the culture, then it's important that it be understood in context. So, I mean, one example is like that. Like I have sympathy for like the don't wear native headdress arguments, because it's like it's a sacred item and it's part of this whole like religious spiritual system, and so it like taking it out of context and just wearing it as a costume, I could get why people don't like that.
I do too. I have a lot of sympathy for it.
Okay, I think we can leave it there, and I should get back to Hicks's argument. So basically, it's the idea that there's this lineage of philosophers that slowly undermined the basic principles of modernism. I mean, the idea is like Heidegger prefigured postmodernism in a lot of ways. He basically said, like, similar to a lot of postmodernists, that language traps us in these these oppositions and in these like constrained ways of thinking, and in this world of reason that's like bloodless and emotionless, and it's so horrible to be there. But Heidegger believed that you could follow a strain of instinct and emotion to a place that was like beneath language and experience like a moment of being beyond discourse, right? Like he believed that there was a self, or like a Dasein, that like yearned for that place, and that you could get there with great effort by following your emotions. And so postmodernists don't have that hope. That's basically a big part of the evolution that happened there, is they took away the hope of getting beyond language. And then you get into the postmodernists, who we've been talking about a bit: Foucault, Derrida, Rorty, Lyotard. It became like influential in the second half of the 20th century.
Right. And backing up a little bit, Hicks kind of details where this kind of radical collectivism came from. Talks about how Rousseau said that the individual basically doesn't matter. If the state calls for the destruction of the individual, then the individual should simply submit. He talks about how Hegel talks about worshiping the state, that the state is essentially almost an incarnation of God or spirit on earth. And that, you should just not fight it. and then, yeah.
And Heidegger was a Nazi.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
So you had these right and left versions of radical collectivism. And at the end of World War II, the right version was basically defeated and demoralized and demonized, rightly so. And it seems like communism essentially has also been defeated, although there's still like the Chinese version.
There's still people who will like call themselves communists and Marxists and stuff.
Yeah, anyway, people who say, "Oh, it was never really tried." So we want the socialism that still hasn't been tried.
Yeah, it's different. I mean, we can say communism was kind of defeated in the Cold War, kind of, but it's not completely socially unacceptable to call yourself a communist, or at least a socialist, in academia or in society in the West. And I think it's becoming more and more acceptable.
Which is so weird.
We could get into that, yeah. But just I guess just to finish summarizing Hicks, the basic thing he does is he outlines this genealogy of epistemology that led to postmodernism, and this political genealogy that, in his view, led to the defeat of the left. And so he kind of views these as like dovetailing into like in the moment when postmodernism was like the logical next step in philosophy, the left was like on the decline. So the left has kind of grabbed this epistemological sword and was like, well, we've been defeated in the field of reason. There is no reason, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a dumb game anyway.
Said. Dumb game anyway. Yeah. That question Chris just asked was kind of interesting. It's like, why is it still acceptable to call yourself a communist and not a fascist?
Well, obviously, because real communism has never been tried, but real fascism was tried. And we saw what happened with that.
I think that communism and socialism like play nicely with Enlightenment values that we've all been taught, of like equality and care for the weak and things like this. Like the end goals, or at least the purported end goals of communism, seem good to people who grew up in our context in a way that the end goals of fascism and Nazism do not. Like in a society where anti-racism is such an important thing, like you just can't be a fascist. But communism, it's easy to think like, oh well, maybe it just wasn't tried, or like maybe it was our regressive Western empires that like sabotaged every socialist project that's ever happened. Like it seems to flow easier from at least kind of the culture that I grew up on. And I remember like being taught about McCarthyism in school when in the 50s, there was basically this thing where like people who were communists would be kind of excommunicated or like blacklisted or maybe even put in prison and things like that. And we were taught about that. Like that was a really, really bad thing. Like almost even in my education in the early 2000s, there was kind of a subtle, the communists were misunderstood kind of thing going on.
Well, but at the same time, I mean, obviously it was a big conspiracy theory. You know, it was like, it was a big witch hunt, basically. And so, you know, we hear about the Salem witch trials and we hear about McCarthyism. And I think the point of teaching kids those stories is kind of the same, which is that, well, you should have, what's it called? You should have due process, you know, and you shouldn't just accuse everybody of, you know, being evil. And then, you know, as soon as they defend somebody that is on the blacklist, then they get blacklisted too.
True, but like there are lots of witch hunts that we could talk about. Why do we choose the ones that we chose?
I was just gonna say, I wonder if like this period will be looked back upon in that way.
What do you mean?
Witch hunt. Like, yeah, like this was a witch hunt.
Do you mean like in terms of cancel culture?
And cancel culture and all the social media giants like banning people. And
I think so. I absolutely think so.
Actually, whoa, yeah, this is like the new McCarthyism.
Yeah. It's crazy, like, I realize also while we're talking, like, I don't think I've ever met a single person that has the courage to call themselves a fascist, even though I've met a lot of people whose views are like, you know, you could be a fascist or you could be like a neo-fascist. Like, no one, I feel like I'd like have respect for someone if they were just like, yeah, so I'm a fascist, I'm a neo-fascist. Like, I've never met anyone. Have you guys?
I've met one.
Really?
Yeah.
I assume it was a he. I assume it was a he.
Yeah, it was a he.
Like?
He was a former voluntarist ANCAP who went fash. He went the fashy direction, and I can't say a whole lot about. He was really personable, funny guy. You know, it was weird. It was somebody that I knew in the past, and he moved away, and I kept looking at his Facebook and saw it getting like more and more fascist, and I was really disturbed. And so I was visiting the area where I knew he was living now, and I was like, I'm going to try to meet for coffee with this guy because I just want to see what he's like now. Like, is he still like a personable, jovial human being? And he was, and it was really surreal, and I don't quite know what to make of it. But yeah, he was a fascist. It was a scary thing. He was like in the Berkeley riots, you know, with a shield and all that jazz.
Oh, wow.
So basically what you're saying is that fascists are by and large pretty okay people, kind of jovial and cool.
Totally. That's absolutely what I'm saying. Not at all, but at least this guy. But that was something that really like rattled my paradigm because I always thought that like people who were the enemy or who believed things that I consider really abhorrent would be people that I would meet and consider abhorrent, and like I would get some kind of vibe from them, you know? Right. But it made me see that evil is less cartoon character evil and more twisted. And they have friends, they have family, they love, they joke, they can be nice, and they can be charismatic, and that's how they can get people to believe in what they believe.
It's like Jordan Peterson says, like the ideology is never 100% of you, right? It's like the ideology, like when you're possessed by an ideology, it becomes like 10% of you or 30% of you or 60% of you, but there's always a little bit of you. Like if there was no you, then yeah, you wouldn't be an appealing vessel.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that got to me is he was still clearly very motivated by doing what he felt was good and right and like would help people.
Like going back to this question of, you know, why is fascism so like unspeakable, and why is communism like totally socially acceptable or mostly socially acceptable? I think maybe it does have something to do with what I was talking about at the beginning of the episode, where basically like progress, like social progress in terms of the Enlightenment meant basically equalizing things, and giving opportunities to people equality of opportunity. I guess is how Hicks would put it, and how Jordan Peterson would put it. Where National Socialism and fascism are kind of like, they're counter to that. and they basically say, well, no, like this group of people is better than all the other groups of people, and so it's morally good to just help this group of people at the expense of everyone else. So I think communism and socialism, at least socialism, I think maybe not communism, but socialism is kind of basically in line with, well, everybody should be equal, everybody should have equal opportunity. But I think there's a very thin line that gets crossed when you go from equality of opportunity to equality of outcome. And I think that the left is crossing that line in a dangerous way.
Here's a big, if I can, I think that the biggest reason is because I think the primary reason why communism is seen as a bad thing today is because of the effects of communism when it was put into action. It's because of all the people that died under Stalin. It's because of the gulags. It's because of the famines. It's because of these things. It's not, I mean, people do criticize the ideas, but I think the primary reason why people are anti-communist is because of the effects and not because of the ideas themselves. It was always framed to me as like, communism sounds like a beautiful idea on paper, but it's a disaster because of selfish human nature.
Yeah, that's true. It's almost like we're the problem, not communism.
Right.
Yeah, I think that is the cinching point, that the ideas of socialism have never been defeated intellectually. I would add, I think a lot of communist policies have been put into place with what is popularly perceived as some degree of success. Like Marx, at the time that he lived, Marx called for like free healthcare and free education and stuff like that. And at the time that was very radical, but now it's like accepted. It's in place. And so, I think we live in welfare states that are already a little bit socialist. So I think there's an idea also that some socialism is good.
Yeah. And people like socialism, and the millennial generation seems to want a lot more of it.
Well, and actually, this is how liberal capitalism has survived, is implementing a little bit of socialism to prevent revolution. So this is when Hicks was talking about, the leftists kept getting frustrated because, well, the contradictions of capitalism haven't become bad enough, or maybe the proletariat is just too lazy or something like that, or maybe the capitalists are poisoning their minds and making them seem like they're happy when they aren't really happy. And it does seem like that's partially true, that the system has started giving out free stuff to poor people, and so it's removing the motivation for them to revolt.
So what do you guys think of this idea that postmodernism has been mainly a front to rehabilitate socialism after its perceived moral defeat after the failure of the Soviet Union?
I disagree with it. I don't think postmodernism is a front. I think this is where I disagree with Hicks. I generally got a lot of value, and think I agree with. I don't know enough about the history, but I think I agree with his tracing of the history, and I agree that there is a link and an enmeshment between postmodernism and leftism. But I don't think that postmodernism is a front. I think it's like when I was reading Foucault, I found it really intellectually rich. I found these ideas and like the criticisms of modernism to be strong. I think I see myself maybe more along the lines of where Nietzsche was, where like maybe we can kind of get to reality or like hint at it or touch it. I don't see ourselves as completely detached, but like I see a lot of value in what postmodernists were saying, but I see a lot of value in what they're saying. And I definitely don't think that they just came up with this whole philosophy and bullshit justification as a front for leftism. But I do think that it is like the main proponents of it were leftist, and it's an amazing tactical guidebook if you understand their stuff.
You've said that before. Like I'm kind of curious, like what you kind of got out of this, or like what guidebook.
It's kind of evil. Like I'm not saying do it, but now that I've read some of it, what I mean by guidebook is like the idea of deconstructing ideas and questioning truth and criticizing what people say, not based on what they're saying really, but based on their position of power, and like their history and all of these things. It's just a really good way to destabilize any of your opponent's arguments and push your own stuff in.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that going back to the question of, is postmodernism a front for modern leftism or something like that? I don't think it was intentionally that way. What I think happened was that the left co-opted postmodernism for its purposes, in the same way that if you go to the what was that subreddit? The ANCAP subreddit was kind of co-opted by like the alt-right. I think a lot of times when you have an ideology that is precisely anti-ideology and says we don't believe anything, then all that does is it opens the door for somebody with a strong but maybe marginalized ideology to come in and just take over the social the social group.
Well, I don't think that we can say that it was co-opted in the same way, because the most influential postmodern philosophers were themselves leftists. So it wasn't like taken over. It was kind of, the philosophy was baked in with this leftist viewpoint from the beginning, and probably they were leftists hanging out with leftists, discussing with other leftists. So it evolved in that kind of a way. But I don't think that means that there's nothing to the philosophy, or that the philosophy was only a front.
Well, I think that's what the postmodernists would say. The postmodernists would say, well, Foucault and Derrida and all these people were leftists, and therefore it's a leftist ideology or something like that. But I think a modernist would say, well, maybe they came up with this philosophy as kind of apolitical, and they weren't thinking about their politics or their particular agendas. And I think it could be read both ways.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you think, Ariel, do you think that postmodernism would have to be inherently political? Like, do you think that you could be a right-wing postmodernist who is like critical of institutions and had kind of a Derrida-like viewpoint on the way that language influences us, but held right-wing politics?
You're muted.
That's a really tough question. There's like a lot to respond to in what you guys are talking about. I mean, it depends how you define postmodernism. I mean, that's what some people accuse Jordan Peterson of being. Like, that's basically what Sam Harris accused Jordan Peterson of being.
Of being a right-wing postmodernist?
Yes.
Interesting. I haven't heard about that. How could Jordan Peterson be construed as a postmodernist?
Well, I think the idea is that he's just a hop, skip, and a jump away from a postmodernist, because he has a view of truth, is a pragmatic view of truth, basically. That which is useful is true. He's not actually. You can take Jordan Peterson's philosophy, and depending on how you define useful, I guess, it doesn't necessarily imply any direct correspondence to the external world. Jordan Peterson is more like Hegelian, probably, or like Nietzschean. Like, he's a very Nietzschean philosophy, like post-Jungian. Like, Jordan Peterson is saying that, and Jordan Peterson is making a claim that there's objective truth, or that there's external truth in the realist sense that we can know, because he's basically saying that which is useful tells us what is true. But to say that, he has to like basically posit some kind of order to the universe. That's why he's quasi neo-theist,
right? But which he has been up until the moment sort of reluctant to admit that. No, he hasn't. That God does definitely exist objectively. I don't think he's ever actually made that claim.
He doesn't want to be misinterpreted, but he definitely makes the argument that there's a grand order to things. He makes it pretty explicitly. I think that's what makes Jordan Peterson not a postmodernist, is because he thinks there's a grand order, and he thinks that by investigating what is useful, we get a guide to what is true, because we are in some way aligned with the universe. And so as beings who are aligned with the universe, that which is useful to us tells us something about what the universe is. And that's where he's not a postmodernist. But someone like Sam Harris would say he's not that far from being a postmodernist.
Yeah, it seems to me that just being a human being in the world, you can't really fully believe in postmodernism because, or anti-realism, I guess. Like you can't, if you had the belief that nothing is true and nothing that we do or say or learn or experience can get us any closer to the truth than we are currently, then that would remove the motivation to do anything, as far as I can tell. And so
that's assuming that the only motivation is to move closer to truth, but
move closer to truth or to move closer to good. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Those don't have to be the only motivations. I mean, Nietzsche would say that those are like weak sauce, beta cuck, moralist, loser motivations.
What would he say is the real motivation? Will to power?
Will to power. Like you're carving out the reality for yourself.
Yeah,
deciding what you want, not what is good, but what you want. What is
right? But he's still positing the existence of a moral good.
He's not. He's saying
that you have a picture of what the moral good is.
No, you're beyond good and evil. You want to be a being beyond good and evil. Trying to reel it in a little bit. I mean, one thing that I found interesting in the Foucault reading is that, like, Stephen Hicks talks about this, like, genealogy between leftism and postmodernism. And it seems like a lot of leftists and postmodernists kind of want to deny that genealogy to the point of even, like, underplaying, like, Foucault and Derrida's Marxism, early Marxism. But it's interesting, in this essay that we read for An Ethic of Discomfort, Foucault kind of talks about the same history that Stephen Hicks talks about. Like, he talks about, like, Foucault was in the Communist Party of France before he became a famous philosopher. And so it's interesting because he talks about, what does he say? Basically the Soviet Union laid down everything that claimed to be of the left, either subjecting it to its own law or outlawing it. So he basically talks about how the left was, like, under the sway of the Soviet Union in the post-war period, which is kind of interesting that he doesn't, like, locate himself in that story. Like, he talks about it in, like, kind of a way of like the Soviet Union was, like, tyrannizing the left in this way. It's almost how he puts it, even though, like, he kind of fell into that.
Yeah, he was totally a fan when it was going on.
Yeah, he was a fan of what was going on. He doesn't really get into that in this essay.
Yeah, but he was just being, he was just being discoursed into the power games of the Soviet Union. So it wasn't really his fault.
Well, I mean, I guess we all change our minds about things. It's a little strange that he doesn't, like, talk about it though. But yeah,
it's just a part of the flow.
But yeah, so then he talks about Khrushchev, Budapest, the political justifications crumbled. Like, Khrushchev admitted to the atrocities that happened under Stalin, and it was what happened in Hungary. Like, the Soviet Union basically cracked down on, like, other socialists. De-Stalinization, the crisis of Marxism. And so he basically said that the question of the left became, we exist, now it is time to know who we are. So he fully acknowledges the left has had a crisis of identity. And he is kind of positioning his work here as, like, a way to address that crisis of identity. So in a way, like, I don't totally think that Hicks is completely off base in saying that, like, postmodernism emerged out of the leftist crisis of identity that followed, like, the delegitimization of the Soviet Union. But it doesn't seem as sinister as Hicks laid out. I don't think it was like, Foucault and Derrida were going like, how can we strike a blow against these modernists? It's more like all this stuff happened and they were in the middle of it, and then they're, like, thinking about it and coming up with new ideas.
It's interesting, like, reading this book and then reading Foucault convinced me a lot of something a lot closer to Stephen Hicks's position than what I had going into it, not knowing much and just, hearing people say their stuff. It's like, it's funny because people who are defending postmodernism are trying to take postmodernism out of context, which is exactly, it's like antithetical to postmodernism. And it seems undeniably true in my modernist phrasing that postmodernism did emerge out of leftism. But I can imagine a different history, or like an alternate universe where a right-wing thinker, where a right-wing thinker like continued to go down the line from Nietzsche, and I'm forgetting the name of the philosopher who was talking about the tribalism.
Herder.
Yeah,
Johann
Nietzsche.
Herder.
Yeah, I can imagine an alternate reality where a right-wing thinker continued down the line of Nietzsche and Herder and developed something like postmodernism with all its criticism, like with all its criticism of language and constructs and like how we can't escape our context, and developed a right-wing postmodernism. It's just that didn't happen. What we have is a left-wing postmodernism.
Let's do it. Okay, so no, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's say let's say the Nazis won World War II. And Hegel became, the great state philosopher of the Nazi Empire. And Hegel had like a brilliant student who agreed with all of Hegel's central points, but didn't agree that we could ever reach an emotive, intuitive place beyond and beneath language. And so this right wing, son of Nazism, son of Nazi Germany, disciple of Heidegger. Yeah, it was very much influenced by Herder. I believe that every people had like a different racial psychology and a different way of understanding the world, and a different, they might emphasize more genetics over language, the right-wing postmodernists of this alternate universe.
They might, but they might also, they wouldn't have to. They could emphasize language and culture because race tends to be linked with language, or at the very least, tribe is completely linked with language. And so your whole framework, and in a postmodernist viewpoint, your entire system of being has been constructed by the language of your tribe. So you wouldn't have to go to genetics, though they might.
Yeah, interesting. They would probably actually emphasize like the link between language, culture, and genetics. Like they'd probably say that those three things can't be separated and that they're ultimately the same thing. So it wouldn't have, postmodernism still has like, it still slides over the ethnic pretty fluidly, but this one would probably be more like, land and blood kind of thing. Land, blood, language.
Right. And they would probably use deconstructive techniques to like deconstruct the ideology or like the power structure of multiculturalism. And I mean, actually, we kind of see this happening in the alt right now a bit.
We also see it in intersectionality on the left.
Yeah, that's his kind of argument, is that they're ultimately very similar. You could probably use the postmodern. Yeah, they might not. Yeah, this alternate universe right wing postmodernism might not focus on the ideas of opposition as much, like the oppositions in language, oppression, oppressor. It might. Maybe it would. Maybe it would just frame it differently.
Mm-hmm. It could. Well, I think that it might in a way be more, or it would be collectivist, but it would focus on different collectives. I think it would talk about, well, I'm thinking about what people talk about now, like the globalist agenda to tear apart like individual cultures and races and ethnicities. I think it could set up those oppositions like there's some kind of like destructive modernist force that's trying to destroy our identities.
Yeah, probably.
And our identities are like the very nature of who we are because of the language, genetic, blood and soil link.
Right. It might not say that modernism is trying to destroy the essence, destroy the nature of who we are, or that it's trying to, I guess it's not that different from Foucault. It could say it's trying to construct us in a different way. It's trying to construct us in a different, well, actually, no, maybe it would, because there is the genetic link. It'd be hard for them to go as far as the modern postmodernists in denying an essential nature. If they're linking it so hard to genetics.
They wouldn't have to hang on to genetics, though.
Yeah, they'd have to either go one way or the other. They'd have to either hang on to genetics and posit some kind of, at least as far as the individual goes, essential nature, or they'd let go of genetics and let things be more slidey.
Yeah. It's really not a stretch. Like, I don't think it would even be that different. Like, I could, it doesn't even seem like you would need this vast evolution. It seems like you could even just have like a leftist convert to the alt-right start talking about it tomorrow.
Yeah, it probably like they'd rely more on the Nietzschean ideas, like the idea of like the Übermensch and the will to power. Because I think that for the right wing to work, one essential difference is it would need to be like left wing postmodernism kind of has this idea that you understand things best by like looking at things from like the subaltern perspective, like the perspective of the oppressed. Like when you look up from the perspective of the oppressed, you can, or when you make the like there's all these secret oppressions in the world, and when you make them clear, then you understand better. And so the idea is like that like identifying with the oppressed is like an epistemological key to understanding. I think the right would need to reverse it somehow.
Maybe, but have you noticed that like lately, and maybe they're just getting this from the left-wing postmodernists, but have you noticed that lately the right wing is like framing themselves as actually we're the white people are the oppressed and white genocide and all these things? Yeah,
I have seen that. Although in this alternate universe, I guess you'd have Nazi Germany being dominant, but
right.
so it would be different.
It would be different.
Yeah, I mean, if it's like, I feel like it would need to be at least. I feel like it would probably be a master morality, like you guys know the master morality, slave morality.
Yeah,
I guess I'll just briefly explain for the audience. So Nietzsche says basically that like all moralities in history have been divided into master moralities and slave moralities. Master moralities say it's good to be boss, basically, like it's good to be strong and powerful and smart and successful, and it's bad to not be those things. And slave morality flips it around and says like, no, actually, it's bad to be successful, it's bad to be boss, it's bad to be dominant, and it's virtuous to be, you know, the meek and the weak and the so on and so forth. That there's a righteousness to being the downtrodden.
Humility.
Yeah. I think that there's actually a bit of truth in both of those. I think that Keith Johnstone in Impro makes the point that sometimes being oppressed gives you a lot of power. Those are both good strategies depending on who is espousing them. So if you're kind of weak and downtrodden, then it kind of makes sense for you to have this slave morality that you follow with like, 90% of humanity. And that gives you power. Or if you're sort of a more powerful or stronger or responsible person or something like that, then it makes sense for you to follow the master morality.
But it sounds like you're espousing some kind of meta master morality by saying actually the slave morality is good because it gives you power.
I'm not saying that it's good. I'm just saying that it's effective.
I feel like a right-wing version of postmodernism would need to be a master morality, because there's like slave morality elements in postmodernism as it currently is, or at least in like the Foucault Derrida version of it. And I feel like in a world where the right came up with postmodernism first, like I guess where the intellectual arena was dominated by the right, and the right came up with postmodernism, it would have to be a master morality. And any really effective right-wing morality would need to be a master morality, or else it's just the same thing but flipped.
Are you kind of equating the right wing with master morality and the left wing with slave morality?
Not necessarily, in all cases. But in the 20th century, basically the defeated political system that needs to be recuperated is fascism, which is a master morality, and in the defeated leftist political system that has been not defeated but at least weakened / defeated leftist political system that needs to be recuperated as socialism, which is a slave morality. And so it seems to me like if the right just makes himself a victim and just like reverses the left thing, and then it's just the same thing. It's just a victim morality. So it's the exact same ideas. There's nothing interesting about it. But if there was a way for the right to take postmodernism and somehow structure it around a master morality, come with an epistemology that justifies a master morality, which is challenging. That's the challenge.
So I think maybe why this is harder than it needs to be is because you said, well, Nazi Germany would be dominant. And I don't think that's comparable to what actually happened in real life. That was an alternate universe example, but right. So I think the proper alternate universe, if we want to look at exactly the opposite of what happened in our universe, is that liberal capitalism still won, but communism got demonized and defeated, and fascism was like the new socialism, where it's like okay to be fascist, and it kind of is cool to be fascist in academic circles, but liberal capitalism is still in charge.
Well, I mean, we could say maybe that's where the world we're in now is kind of approaching that, because there's sort of like this like neo-fascist resurgence, and people aren't calling it fascist, but it's not that far from fascism, or at least it's comparable distance fascism than modern leftism.
But it's not okay to be that yet. Like it's not okay to like Trump. It's not even okay to like hint at possibly not hating Trump.
It's becoming more acceptable.
I'm feeling like a little bit of disappointment that we're not actually talking about what like a postmodern epistemology that justified a master morality would be.
Yeah, so this is
I guess
where
we
I
don't
was.
have to.
I was going to talk about that, and here's what I was going to say. So basically, if we switch the alternate reality such that liberal capitalism is still dominant, but instead of the right wing ideology getting demonized and going away, we had the left wing ideology getting demonized and going away. And so anybody who's a postmodern sort of right wing person is probably in academia because it's okay to be kind of fascist in academia in this alternate reality. And so what kind of postmodernism would they come up with? And so that's where I was going with that. And I think probably what they would say is that, and maybe to answer your question, how is it going to be a master morality? Maybe fascism has been like kind of discredited, and it, instead of just going away completely, it needs to be fixed, kind of in the same way that socialism has kind of been discredited a little bit, but it needs to be fixed, right? We can still have fascism someday, and it'll be glorious and whatever, but it'll be like there'll be like Hitler got something wrong, and what was it that he got wrong?
Just go back a little bit. Like, how would you lay out the epistemology of the slave morality that underlies the postmodernism that exists in this reality?
There's these oppositions that exist in language, and there's these power relations that exist in language. And so you have situations where there's these dominant discourses of power that flow through society. And so, according to Foucault, if you're just articulating the discourses that are dominant, you're not really breaking new ground, because those discourses are already they're already active in people's minds. But when you undermine the power that already exists, you bring people's assumptions and presuppositions into clear relief, right? So if you're Foucault talks a lot about there's how we should deal with crazy people. So he's writing people who are crazy. There's people who are healthy and there's people who are crazy. That's like a dichotomy. People who are sane and there's people who are crazy. So that's like a dichotomy or an opposition that exists in language and in our understanding. And then the crazy people go to institutions, and every element of their life needs to be controlled. And that's like it's a set of power relations that surround the crazy people. But it also surrounds us. We're just not aware of it. It's the same system of power. We're all part of the same system. And we're also being limited by that system of power. And so if you're just going out there being yeah, so there are sane people, there are crazy people, and it is good that we lock them away, then you're not actually breaking any new ground, because you're just saying what people already think is true. But if you point out that set of power relations exists, and you undermine it in some way, or you talk about it in a way that draws attention to its artificiality, then you're breaking new ground. And so that's why looking at it from the perspective of the group that gets messed with is, in Foucault and Derrida's view, a pathway to understanding, an epistemological strategy.
So I think you could do something similar. Obviously, this isn't complete. But instead of imagining it as a top-down, the oppressors and the oppressed, and the dichotomies in the power structures are set up that way, imagine it if you viewed power as more bottom-up. And there's the masses and the mass culture, which is kind of a crab in the bucket kind of situation. And anybody who's trying to break free from that and be an Ubermensch and gain influence and be a person in and of themselves is pulled down by all of the narratives that society and everyone around them is telling them. So even if you were using that example of healthy people and insane people, well, geniuses and people who go against societal norms are often seen as insane. So you need to do some things that were seen as insane potentially, or live in that to maybe become great and move forward in this right wing kind of way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's with Foucault, he doesn't see it as there's an oppressor and an oppressed in most cases necessarily. He more views it as power is diffused through society, and we're all kind of enacting it. And so in a way that almost does support this idea of more the crab in the buckets idea, because Foucault isn't actually saying there's he says it's more just during the Middle Ages, it's the king with his sword, and that's how we tend to view power, is there's a king that's enjoying all the power. But in reality, it's we're all subject to power, and we're all enacting it on others. And so
Right.
So that does actually dovetail pretty well with like a fascist perspective of like the masses suck, basically.
Right. It's the same, but I think like Foucault sees like we're all subjects of power and we're all enacting it, but kind of like in service of a hierarchy. Whereas this perspective would be all like we're all subjects of power and we're all enacting it. But what it is it's like a toxic, jealous culture that's trying to keep great ones down.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the wolves tearing at each other's heels, basically. Which actually is like, it's not quite Nietzsche, but it's like, it totally works as like a post-Nietzschean thing.
There we go. Right-wing postmodernism.
And it wouldn't even be saying that it's like it's good to become like the one that rises, but maybe it would be like the one that rises is the only one that can actually understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Actually, that sounds kind of Randian. And actually,
that's where I was pulling from.
Yeah, no, I've always thought that. So Ayn Rand has like this epistemology which sounds a lot like Hicks's epistemology, which is, man has reason and everything comes from his reason. Everything comes from reason, and so the self is the most important thing. The individual is the most important thing. Individual achievement is the most important thing, and the great evil is altruism and sacrificing yourself for what you believe is the good of the whole, and moochers and looters and all that. It kind of reminds me of that. And I never thought that her epistemology actually matched up with her moral philosophy. So maybe her moral philosophy is kind of postmodernist, and she doesn't realize it.
What do you mean, her moral philosophy being postmodernist?
Well, because you guys just explained what you thought sounded like a right-wing postmodernism, and I just said, well, that sounds like Ayn Rand.
Oh, what I was doing was I was imbuing postmodernism with a Randian morality, because the postmodernism that we have is imbued with a leftist morality. Yeah, and what I'm saying is maybe Rand's moral philosophy can be derived much better from postmodernism than from what she believes her epistemology to be, which I find kind of incoherent.
I mean,
see, I don't see moral philosophy as being derived from postmodernism. I see it as like postmodernism is amoral, and you put your morality into it and then employ postmodernism as like a weapon to enact it.
Right, exactly.
That's pretty cynical. I mean, I think it's more complicated than that. Like, I do think there is...
Definitely.
It's actually kind of a postmodern, probably, way of viewing the relationship between epistemology and morality, but I kind of do think that there are... It's like there is sort of like a continuity between epistemology and ethics and morality. But it is like... Because we had to like manipulate the epistemology a bit to get it to work with like a master morality. We couldn't, so there is like a relationship there, but it's not, but yeah. I guess I do, yeah. I guess it is a modernist perspective on my part. I kind of see it as like a whole, and you have to change something here if you're going to change something here.
Yeah. I also agree with you. I just want to clarify, like when I was saying that, I was embodying like a postmodernist perspective of, like, as a postmodernist, do I see morality being derived from postmodernism? And the answer is no. Like, if I was acting as a postmodernist. I think there's a relationship, but, okay, this is kind of a tangent. I don't know if you want to go on it or not. But my experience when I met that fascist frightened me and made me question the relationship between epistemology and morality and like ultimate ends, or because either I had to accept there is no relationship, or the relationship is weak enough that things can go wildly differently, or I had to accept I share epistemology with a fascist.
Wait, how so? What epistemology did you share?
Well, at the time we were both coming from anarcho-capitalism, which, okay, yeah, like it seems like that does seem to lead to fascism in a lot of cases, so...
No, I think
there's no relationship.
No, I think it's a situation of co-opting, like we said before, or like I said before.
I think there is.
I don't know. I think there is too. I mean, Stefan Molyneux
is the person who co-opted ANCAPism for fascism.
He's no. This goes way back. Like that's what a lot of ANCAPs may like to think, but read Rothbard in the 90s, and he went right-wing populist.
All right, well, I guess I'll have to read Rothbard then.
I mean, the basic argument seems to be that if you want there to be a system without government or with minimal government, then you gotta dismantle the welfare state before you take down the borders. Because if you take down the borders before you dismantle the welfare state, there'll be like a rush of third world people to the first world, and there'll be like chaos and war and all kinds of, maybe a one world government scenario, all kinds of undesirable things from the ANCAP perspective. So it seems to be a basic tactical argument that you gotta take down the welfare state before you take down the borders. That seems to be the basic, from what I can see, the basic insight that leads from ANCAPism to nationalism.
Well, but taking down the welfare state doesn't equate to fascism.
No, but I mean, it seems to be that you have that insight that you have to take down the welfare state before you take down the borders. And so therefore the borders must stay in place. Therefore we must have strong borders. And so on and so forth.
Right. And then what tends to happen is people say, like, actually, we need to keep the borders because in order to have this governmentless society or minimal government society where we just have borders, we need a culture that is cohesive. And
yes. Yeah, I just wanted to that's exactly what I was going to say. So like run of the mill, regular vanilla conservatism is just, okay, well, we don't need as much government because it's assumed that there will be some social cohesion and that society sharing a morality will enforce that morality instead of some strong, forceful hand of government that's going to keep everybody in line. And so I guess, if you're on the right wing already and you want the government to completely go away, i.e. you're an anarchist, then I think you're probably assuming an extremely high degree of social cohesion.
What about leftist anarchists, Ariel?
What about them?
Do they assume a strong level of social cohesion that would keep things running smoothly in the absence of a state?
Yeah, actually, kind of. Yeah, they assume there's like a lot of variability, but there's definitely a lot of like leftist anarchists that sort of like argue that there's gonna, like, in the post-revolutionary system, there's gonna be like a lot of like little communities that like stick to themselves and that like love each other like a family, and where everything is done communally and everyone shares everything communally. And yeah, I used to have that dream, and that like some of them are gonna be like all native people. And white people won't be welcome and stuff like that. So there even is like an element of like, and I mean, I don't even like totally disagree with like, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing.
I feel like I'm finally having some kind of a understanding of the horseshoe theory of politics through this conversation.
What can you say what that theory is?
The horseshoe, it's not really a strong theory. It's basically just it's an idea that the radical right and the radical left are not a dichotomy, but it's actually something more like they twist around and almost touch, and the radicals of both sides have much more in common than the centrists.
I mean, nationalism isn't unheard of on the left. Like, you have black nationalism in the 60s, which was like generally Marxist, but not always. Like Malcolm X was pretty like into capitalism. And they're basically like, black people should have their own country. Make of that what you will. But that was the thing that happened. That was a leftist movement. And I mean, it's just whether you have a slave morality or a master morality, whether you think that like having an ethno-state is the purview of the oppressed or the oppressor. Or I guess it's more who you view as the oppressed or the oppressor. Or I guess whether you think it's the purview of the oppressed, or whether you view it as like everyone who wants to has the right to an ethno-state. But there are also a lot of leftists who are very cosmopolitan. And leftists will definitely tend to more emphasize culture over blood. Anyway, I'm noticing the time. Do we want to have like our brief Jordan Peterson discussion and try to wrap it up in a bit?
Yeah, that
Sure.
sounds good. It's not that I have nothing to say. It's just there's so much.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I know. We could really go on with this stuff.
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson. So our question about Jordan Peterson is, so Jordan Peterson endorsed Stephen Hicks. We've just been discussing his work. So what does it tell us that Jordan Peterson endorsed Stephen Hicks? First off, like how does Jordan Peterson's ideas compare to Stephen Hicks? Like, what do we think?
Well, I think that Jordan Peterson was heavily influenced by Stephen Hicks in how he traces the lineage of postmodernism and linking it to leftism and Marxism. Although, now that I've read the Postmodernists, it feels like leftists and postmodernists want to make it seem like Jordan Peterson is just drawing this conspiracy where there's no connection and postmodernism is not a political movement. But I mean, now that I'm reading Foucault, it doesn't seem like Stephen Hicks or Jordan Peterson got their ideas out of nowhere.
Foucault was fully saying, that's the thing, that's what, it's crazy. Foucault was fully saying, yeah, so Stalinism was discredited, and then, we leftists were having an identity crisis, and so I'm a postmodernist. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also notable that Derrida has a book called Spectres of Marx.
Yeah.
Which is I haven't read it. I kind of want to now, but it's supposed to be, talking about politically applying deconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, in one of the readings you read, I think, The Truth and Subject and the Truth or something. Foucault's fully talking about how there's three forms of power that can there's sovereign power, which was dominant in the Middle Ages. There was or resistance to it was dominant in the Middle Ages. There's economic exploitation, and resistance to that was dominant in the 19th century, and they both did a very good job. And these days it's disciplinary power, and he's trying to take on that. So it's fully kind of saying yeah, still down for Marx, but it's incomplete.
I feel so comfortable with the term postmodern neo-Marxism now, whereas I did not before. Because people are no, Marxism is a totally, it's got a narrative, and it's totally modernist thing, and it's just, I don't know, they were saying Marxism contradicts postmodernism, and it does in some ways, but it's clear to see that's why it's neo-Marxism. It's an evolution.
That's why I feel some people, honestly, I feel some postmodernists are just or people who have been influenced by postmodernism, it's Jordan Peterson says, they're using language instrumentally. They're not really.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, it's a tactic.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I mean, I don't want to make it seem like I'm totally bashing on postmodernism, because I actually really like Foucault. I think a lot of his followers are messed, and a lot of his ideas were messed. But basically, I think a lot of, maybe I'll cut that part out. I don't know.
Did you say messed?
Messed. I said messed, which is an academic term.
Oh, what does that mean?
Fucked.
It means imbued with the spirit of the specter of the dialectical fucked upness.
Of course.
Anyway, it just I sometimes feel like postmodernism has this tactic of deconstructing language, which is basically when you take a word and you show all the ways that it's used inconsistently, or you show you look up its etymology and you show all the different ways that it's used, and you basically prove that it has no consistent meaning that can apply all the time. And Derrida basically showed that you can do this to any word in language. You can do this anywhere. So it's basically the death of objective meaning, or of the correspondence between language and the external world. And so I sometimes find that postmodernists or people who are influenced by postmodernism do this selectively. They'll be yeah, so this term postmodern neo-Marxism has no they'll do it to that term, but then they'll take Marxism and be this is what Marxism means. This is
right.
The definition, which is totally which is totally like you said before, a tactical use of these techniques instead of a sincere use of these techniques. But in the postmodern, sincerity is also it doesn't actually connect to anything real.
Exactly. So it's perfectly acceptable within a postmodern worldview to do it in a not sincere tactical way, because there would be no sincere way. You can only do it in a tactical way. So you might as well just own it.
Yeah, exactly. Like Jordan Peterson says, he calls for you use language to express truth as you understand it. You use language to your best of your ability to express truth. That's one way to use language. Another way to use language is to use language instrumentally. So to use language to attain some end. Yeah. And postmodernism would say that language can only be used instrumentally, whether you know it or not.
I think we still need to grapple, even if we don't want to use language instrumentally, or we consider that a bad, or we don't want to be messed, we still need to grapple with Derrida's criticism of language. Basically, we still need to grapple with the ideas of postmodernism.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's an issue that I see with critics of postmodernism, is they're kind of doing this thing where like postmodernists are leftists and they just want to destroy everything. And then they just like stay modernist and aren't actually engaging with the arguments, which seem really valid. Not the arguments for Marxism, but like the problem with reality.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like, I find like the critics of postmodernists, now that I guess this is the part of the conversation where we criticize everybody, we trash on everybody. But anyway, so the critics of postmodernism, like, I find they'll often do the thing where it's like, you have a very vague idea of what postmodernism is, and then you hear some counter arguments to that vague idea, and those counter arguments are satisfying, and then you feel like you've addressed the issue of postmodernism in your mind. So like, I often hear people kind of expressing the idea of like, well, postmodernism say that we can't say that anything is true, and they're saying that this is true, and therefore postmodernism is garbage. Or if postmodernism says we can't have any dualities, but isn't saying like we shouldn't have dualities of duality, and like it's just based on like it's just like
right.
It's just it's often incorrect, as that those examples were a misrepresentation of postmodernism, and it's like just overly simplistic.
Yeah, it's also simplistic because I mean the thing is, the whole point is that you can pick apart any language and find the inconsistencies. So yes, if you pick apart the postmodernists, you will find the inconsistencies, especially when you're talking about something so, like, this subject is just so tricky. Like, we don't, our language, we have some words for it now. We have the word postmodernism, so that's been a really helpful concept during this conversation. But like, we don't have a lot of the concepts that we need to be able to talk about this well.
And postmodernists aren't trying to escape language, and they're not trying to like assert some kind of universal truth beyond their own objections. They're fully like willing to be, or they're resigned to be trapped within language and dualities and an inability to contact external truth. They don't think they can escape any more than anybody else.
Yeah. I think this is maybe where I'm more with Jordan Peterson, is like, I do see value in sincerity. I don't think that we can fully escape language, but I think that we can try, and I think that we can get closer or further away based on how we communicate. And I think that trying to connect with what the person is saying, and not with what the person is literally saying, but like what the person has inside, is worthwhile. I guess that's assuming that there is something inside beyond language, which they wouldn't agree with. So I guess I'm not a postmodernist.
Something inside beyond language.
I do believe that there is something pre-language that it's very difficult to express. But I mean, a great example is like music. I think that music communicates a lot of things that language doesn't. Maybe you could consider music to be a language, but I think that a lot of music and like the way that certain sounds move and can trigger emotions cross-culturally accesses something deeper than language. And maybe music would probably be the strongest example, like one example that I could give to counter a little bit of what Derrida is saying.
I think Derrida would say that even when you're having an experience like that, it's still being processed through the oppositions of language.
On some level, probably. But I think that it shows, I mean, I think everything's processed through language. Maybe. I think most things are processed through language, and that depends on how your mind works. But there is something that is being processed through, I guess, is what I still maintain. And trying to point to the thing that is being processed rather than focusing on the processing, I think is a worthwhile goal.
Yeah, and I mean, Derrida also, like, I don't know much about what he says about it, but Derrida also identifies, like, signs, like, not, like, non-linguistic forms of communication, like, they're included in his system as well. I can't really speak to it too much, but I guess we'll have to do an episode on Derrida.
We were talking about Jordan Peterson, though, kind of, and then we started talking about our own feelings. I gained more respect for Jordan Peterson through this, honestly. I think, you know, I didn't know that much about it, and I think that I have a tendency, like many people, but maybe me a little bit more, to be a bit swayed by the crowd. And so when there's a lot of people who apparently know a lot about postmodernism, and all the postmodernists are like, Jordan Peterson doesn't understand postmodernism, and this, and this. I was kind of like, okay, it seems like Jordan Peterson is misunderstanding postmodernism. And maybe he is in some level, but after reading Foucault, it's just like, how are you guys not going to admit that there's a leftist connection here? Like,
Foucault fully says it. Like, it's just, like, he talks about it actually a lot. Like, he actually talks a lot about, like, the left's crisis of conscience and...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that probably most people writing articles criticizing Jordan Peterson on the basis of him misunderstanding postmodernism probably have an understanding of postmodernism that is several telephone games away, because, like, who the hell wants to read Foucault and Derrida?
Oh, people read Foucault and Derrida in university.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you haven't read Foucault and Derrida, maybe you shouldn't be writing articles saying that Jordan Peterson is misunderstanding Foucault and Derrida.
Probably. I mean, maybe they have, but I would guess that a lot maybe haven't. And when I say who the hell would want to, like, now I want to read more Foucault and Derrida. It was fun, but
I mean, I think maybe some people who, I don't really get it, actually. I don't really get how someone like, I mean, I shouldn't name names, actually, because I don't know who's made specific claims, but yeah, I don't know how people can deny that link, really. I think
unless it's just a tactic.
It might just be a tactic. I think people really believe it, though, when they're, I don't know. I think people really believe the things they're saying. Like,
well, yeah. I mean, I guess I do believe, and this is kind of a postmodernist belief that I have. I do think that most people, and like myself included, I fall into this all the time. Like, our beliefs and what we advocate for and what we're really emotional about often just like follow these waves, or I'm not going to use Foucault's terminology, right? But like these threads of discourses. And it's just like where the conversation has gone and spiraled to this point. But that doesn't mean that there's like I don't think that most people go through like a process of creating an epistemology for their belief systems.
I mean, yeah, it's rough though. I mean, like, it looked like ContraPoints, who like all but suggests that Jordan Peterson is like buying into a right-wing conspiracy by identifying like cultural Marxism or like postmodern Neo-Marxism, and she's like a very philosophically educated person.
That's interesting. Yeah, she's a philosophy PhD dropout.
Like in her Jordan Peterson video, which we can link to below, like basically like says in the video, like, I'm not going to say that Jordan Peterson is a right-wing conspiracist, but like, you know, says that sentence.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Where?
It's a Jordan Peterson video.
Yeah, no, I know which video you're talking about, but I just wasn't thinking of it. Like, where? This makes me. We've got to get on a post. We need to talk to one of these people if it's possible.
Yeah, it would be cool to have ContraPoints on the show. But anyway,
yeah.
But and there might be something we're misunderstanding. I mean, sometimes I think the issue is it's like a Gestalt feature issue. So like a Gestalt is like when you're seeing everything at once, or you're seeing like a grand pattern, and features is when you're seeing like little individual bits of things. And we do it all the time. Like you have to see patterns and you have to see features in order to function, Gestalts and features. And so sometimes I think there's a thing like that, because often when I see people like critiquing this idea of like postmodern neo-Marxism, they'll say like, well, you know, like Marxism was an economic theory and it said that other forms of oppression stem from economic oppression. Therefore, there's no connection between Marxism and feminism, or there's no connection between Marxism and anti-racist politics. Or they'll say like, you know, like Marxism was a modernist theory. Marxism had grand narratives of history. Marxism posited like was progressive. Postmodernism is none of those things. They're completely different. And all that is true, but it doesn't mean that there aren't other patterns that exist.
Yeah, it's kind of like you can analyze things on one level, like on the level of just what are the arguments that Karl Marx was making? And are those arguments connected to postmodernism? And to make that connection, you can make it, but it's tough. Like, it seems like the foundations of the postmodern, the parts of postmodernism that are like postmodern, like didn't come from Marx. But that doesn't mean that there's not connections on another level, like on a social movement, on an intellectual evolution level, and on the level of the way that these things actually play out in the world. I saw that a lot in the ANCAP voluntarist movement too, where people don't want to admit that there's any connection between ANCAPs and the right wing. There's absolutely a connection between voluntarism and anarcho-capitalism and the right wing and like fascism and racism and these things. That doesn't mean that the philosophy necessarily leads there. That's a separate argument, but there's a connection, and the connection, I think it's, you have to be blinding yourself to not see some kind of connection. Like
there's definitely a high density of Jewish conspiracy theorists at in the ANCAP communities I've encountered.
It kind of reminds me of Pepe the Frog and the alt-right. It's like, yeah, maybe Pepe the Frog was like co-opted by the alt-right, or maybe he was started by people on the alt-right. We don't really know.
No,
Pepe
the Frog was definitely co-opted. The comic book creator who made Pepe is like not alt-right and is really sad and like doesn't make any Pepes anymore and has spoken out against it and everything.
Right.
But that's a perfect example. There's absolutely a connection between Pepe the Frog and the alt-right, and any leftist postmodernist would tell you you're an idiot if you don't see a connection between Pepe the Frog and the alt-right.
And it's crazy because ContraPoints made a video where she basically said that.
Yeah, she has a whole video about like the kind of half joking neo-Nazi fasci kind of symbols.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, but there's no connection. There's no connection between. I mean, we might be missing something. Like, I don't want to be like totally contemptuous. In part because I'm hoping postmodernists will come on our show eventually. So I don't want to be totally contemptuous of it. Like, there's.
Well, I don't. I just want to say I don't feel contemptuous. I feel confused and curious. Like, genuinely, I'm just like, what?
No, I think that
it might be because we're missing something, or it might be because they're missing something.
Yeah, we might be missing something. We might be missing something big. So.
No, I think that, and this is going back to what I was talking about before, I think that actions speak louder than words. And I think that the postmodernists are, if not explicitly, they're implicitly pushing their own agendas. And they're using the tactics of postmodernism and deconstruction and all that to push their own agendas. And well, everybody's doing that, you know? So...
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is I think the idea of cultural Marxism is did come from the right, like is a right wing idea. So that might be why there's this narrative people have that it's a right wing conspiracy theory against the left.
Cultural Marxism is related but kind of separate from this idea of postmodern neo-Marxism, though.
I actually don't know what cultural Marxism is.
Cultural Marxism is basically like in Soviet Russia, there were like a lot of cultural programs like for gender equality and like, well, actually, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't. I shouldn't.
It's basically like Hitler's theory about how the Jews are infecting society in order to dissolve Western civilization.
What?
Yeah. So they're pushing this kind of agenda in order to disassemble the Enlightenment.
Okay, I guess I don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic theory, or at least that's what Wikipedia says.
Well, okay.
I think
cultural Marxism. It's like. You can see it as a conspiracy theory that basically like some people thought that like Jewish people were pushing cultural Marxism in order to do things like dismantle the family and dismantle religion and dismantle like the culture that was there before, so that the Marxism and the state could be total.
Yeah. Yeah, I think part of the reason why people say postmodern neo-Marxism is a right-wing conspiracy theory is they seem to be interpreting the claim as a claim that Marxists have deliberately and secretly gone underground and constructed this new ideology and are using it as like a shell. So it seems to be the idea that there's like a group of people that are deliberately doing all this, where I understood Jordan Peterson's claim as being more a claim that there's this emergent intellectual and political movement, and it's emergent.
Yeah. Hicks did seem to be implying that maybe it was kind of covert. He didn't go so far as to say it, but he like listed a few different possibilities, and like the last ones he listed were basically conspiratorial.
I mean, postmodernism is basically a theory about how people use language in order to further their agenda. So it's like, it's weird to think that the postmodernists would have this theory and then not use it to their advantage. Well, so
it's all such a mess.
Just going back to cultural Marxism, here's what Wikipedia says. Refers to a far-right anti-Semitic conspiracy theory which claims that the Frankfurt School is part of an ongoing academic and intellectual effort to undermine and destroy Western culture and values. According to the theory, which emerged in the late 1990s, the Frankfurt School and other Marxist theorists were part of a conspiracy to attack Western society by undermining traditionalist conservatism and Christianity using the 1960s counterculture, multiculturalism, progressive politics, and political correctness. So it is like a related idea, but I think without necessarily like the conspiracy element, and definitely without the anti-Semitic element.
Okay,
I didn't know that cultural Marxism had such a strong conspiracy element, like inherently.
Yeah, well, and this is Wikipedia, so it's not necessarily 100% true.
Yeah, so maybe the claim is that the term postmodern neo-Marxism is a dog whistle for that older idea.
Right, but I think we should still, I always get a little suspicious whenever I see somebody trying to make a point, trying to criticize something, and then somebody just shouts like, "You're an anti-Semite" or something like that, and it's like, what? What? Or they'll call them, a Nazi, or they'll call them, like some name, and it's just this clear, naked attempt to try and discredit them without addressing their argument.
Yeah, like whenever I talk about how awesome National Socialism was, people just call me anti-Semitic and say I love Hitler. It's,
I mean,
it's just this PC culture,
there are
man.
examples. There are examples of where, people are trying to push, we're criticizing an idea based on. There are nuances.
Yeah, like
it goes both ways.
The flip side would be if somebody was like criticizing someone else's use of language and saying that they were using biased terms, and then somebody just shouted at them, "You're a Marxist," which actually like is happening a lot these days.
But people are cool with being called a Marxist.
Yeah.
Like
more
look at
Zizek.
So. He doesn't explain how he's a Marxist, but
maybe he's a Marxist in like a weird postmodern kind of way. Actually, I have no idea. I don't understand Zizek. I'm going to not say anything at all.
Zizek is on some kind of spectrum. He's on the postmodern spectrum.
He has postmodern personality disorder. No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that, Zizek. I just meant he was on the postmodern spectrum.
Okay.
Shall we wrap up?
I'm aware of the time. Yeah, I'm aware of the time. So, yeah, okay.
All right, now let's talk about our feelings, right?
Let's do that in bonus footage. We're gonna talk about our final takeaways on postmodernism. Final as in we're gonna be talking about this a lot more, and this is definitely not final in the bonus material. So sign up as a patron to see that bonus material, as well as bonus material from all of our other episodes and a lot of other cool stuff.
We've got like shirts and stickers and lots of fun things. And you can talk to us.
Yeah, so thanks guys for watching. If you don't want to sign up as a Patreon, then please like, subscribe, comment, and so forth. We love to hear from you, and we hope to see you in the next episode.
No, we don't want them to be in the next episode. We want them to be watching the next episode.
I hope to see them in the next episode. If you're a postmodernist, we hope to see you in the next episode. Please contact us.
If you're a postmodern scholar, we definitely hope to see you in the next episode. Take care.
Thanks for joining us on the Multiversity Project. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversityproject.co.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.